Chapter 24-29. This uneasiness caused their expressions to distort. It was a distortion formed by the conflict between their emotions on the surface and their instincts in the depths of their hearts. It was a distortion that bordered on irritation. The world's will was the world's will. For all living beings in this world, if there was a problem with the world's will, it meant that there was a problem with the foundation of their existence. Under such circumstances, all living beings were naturally attracted to it, and the focus of their lives had unknowingly shifted to the world's will. Eating and drinking, which were necessary for survival, were suppressed. Fortunately, this world was a world in the sea. What filled the world wasn't the void, but the liquid that was similar to seawater. Therefore, although the necessities of survival such as eating and drinking were suppressed, they could still absorb a certain amount of nutrients from the boundless liquid that permeated between heaven and earth. This was not enough to completely satisfy them, but at least it could sustain their survival for a relatively long time. It was precisely because of this that all living beings in this world kept looking up at the sky. They were either devout or irritated as they looked at the incomparably sacred and dignified light in the sky, as well as the changing vortex. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about all of this. He only guided the world's light to continuously spread out the net and penetrate into various parts of the world's will. He began to work hard to devour the world's will, working hard to turn it into a part of him. Due to various conveniences, the process was rather smooth. In particular, after he cut off the endless karmic luck transmitted by all living beings, preventing the world's will from being replenished, the devouring process became even smoother. 100 years passed in the blink of an eye. During these 100 years, the world's will's residence developed according to the direction it had been set back then. The threads emitted from the world's light had already formed a net that completely filled the vortex, which was also the world's will. Outside the world's will's residence, in this world that was filled with the boundless liquid, all living beings behaved the same as 100 years ago. They still looked up at the sky, either devout, irritated, or uneasy. However, compared to 100 years ago, the number of living beings in this world had decreased by more than half. The reason for the decrease in the number of living beings was not because of anything else, but because of hunger. Although the boundless liquid contained some of the nutrients that living beings needed to survive. However, in the end, it was just a little. Perhaps it could sustain the survival of these creatures for a month or two, or even a year or two. That was only a year or two at most. Compared to the time scale of 100 years, it was still too short. Thus, during these 100 years, most of the creatures that could not absorb enough nutrients gradually died as they looked up to the sky. As for the remaining half of the creatures that could still survive, they were either powerful enough to survive by absorbing energy from the outside world, or they were in a special location where the nutrients in the seawater were much more abundant than in other places and could even satisfy their basic needs. Because of this change, the entire world was filled with a strange feeling. At a glance, those originally pious expressions appeared indescribably terrifying. However, not a single living being paid any attention to this. None of the living beings stopped to look up to their companions because they had starved to death, and they continued with their lives. It was as if the most important thing to them now was to look up to them. Compared to this, everything else was secondary, including their own lives. Even these living beings did not care about this, so naturally, Luo Fan would not care about it either. Seeing that the world's light had already filled up the world's will with countless threads, he let out a soft cry. This cry did not seem very special in the residence of the world's will, but in this world, this cry was so grand and vast that it was indescribable. It felt as if the sky had suddenly rumbled with billions of thunder, causing the entire world to violently tremble. The endless sound poured into the ears of countless living beings and resounded in their hearts. Oh no, the world is going to be destroyed. Countless living beings suddenly woke up at this moment and cried out. This comprehension came from the thunder, as well as their instincts. Only after this comprehension did these living beings pay attention to their surroundings. They noticed the strange changes in this world. At that moment, all sorts of wails, cries, screams, and even maniacal laughter appeared out of nowhere in this world. The endless flow of providence that was originally pouring into the residents of the world's will was forcefully cut off by Luo Fan. Instead, it returned to the world through the characteristics of the residents of the world's will, turning into the endless sacred and dignified light. At this moment, the boundless providence that was being reflected back was completely cut off. As this happened, the light in the sky gradually disappeared. However, Luo Fan's figure did not disappear because of this, and the vortex formed by the world's will did not disappear either. It was just that it lacked that sacredness clearly. Without the return of the endless providence, the light that made all living beings feel sacred and pious had lost its source and could no longer be produced. As Luo Fan cried out, the net that had completely enveloped the world's will in the residents of the world's will began to shrink rapidly. As it shrank, the light in the world gradually swelled, and its color became more and more real and condensed. The light it emitted vaguely showed signs of changing in the direction of the world's will. A long river appeared in the world at this moment. This river was so huge and so long. Just this river alone felt like it had filled the entire world. The great path has appeared? At this moment, Luo Fan finally pulled his attention away from the residents of the world's will and looked towards the world. At this moment, the long river that had appeared in the world and almost completely filled the world was none other than the great path of the world. The great path appeared in the world at this moment and directly enveloped all living beings in the world. It even directly controlled all the laws, time, space, matter, and energy in the world. In the blink of an eye, the great path seemed to have become the center of the world. Everything in the world began to spin around it, forming a strange tornado. Of course, only Luo Fan could see this tornado. To the living beings in this world, all they could see was the world beginning to change. The various lights and shadows they were familiar with were directly replaced by some kind of extremely illusory light and shadow that they could not describe. They did not even know that the great path was manifested in the form of a long river. It's indeed different from the world in the previous world. The great path in the previous world didn't take such initiative. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly when he saw this. In the previous world, no matter what happened to the world's will, whether it was devoured or scattered, whether it was independent or controlled, the great path was as stable as a mountain. It did not move at all, as if the world's will had nothing to do with it. Only when Luo Fan began to directly attack the great path did the great path react. However, the world in this world was completely different. The great path in this world had already taken action before he had completely devoured the world's will. It had taken the initiative to show itself. This difference in initiative made Luo Fan realize something in his heart. He vaguely seemed to understand some of the great path's characteristics. However, this understanding did not matter to him for the time being. At this moment, the great path taking the initiative to show itself brought him some new trouble. At the very least, this meant that he could no longer smoothly devour the world's will. He could not be like before, where he could obtain a certain amount of time after devouring the world's will to deal with the great path. As expected, just as he was thinking about this, the residents of the world's will suddenly collapsed. Luo Fan and the world's will that was being devoured by the light of heaven and earth completely broke away from the residents and appeared directly in the world above the great path. It quickly rushed down towards the great path below and was about to be devoured by the great path. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan did not dare to hesitate at all. He rushed straight towards the world's will. Or, to be more specific, he rushed towards the light of heaven and earth that was currently devouring the world's will. Given the great path's current state, if the light of heaven and earth entered it, it could still resist the great path's corrosion to a certain extent. However, if his body rushed into it, it would be a disaster. Not only would he be corroded by the great path if he rushed into it with his body, but he would also be assimilated, strangled, and devoured by the endless mysteries of the great path. His current body was in human form, and there was a qualitative difference between him and the natural Taoist aptitude in this world. He was completely incompatible with the great Tao. If he entered it, just the rejection of the great Tao would probably be enough to cause him shocking harm. Because of this, the only choice Luo Fan had at this time was, of course, to enter the light of heaven and earth. He used the nature of the light of heaven and earth, which was barely at the same level as the world's will, to protect himself so that he would not be directly harmed by the great path. Although it was his light of heaven and earth, it was still devouring the world's will. When Luo Fan entered it, he still encountered a lot of resistance. It took him a lot of effort to break through this obstacle and enter the light of heaven and earth. He sat down in the center of the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth. Fortunately, his ability to control the light of heaven and earth was strong enough. Otherwise, even if he could enter the light of heaven and earth, he would not be able to return to his position before the light of heaven and earth entered the great path. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. At this time, terrifying corrosive sounds could be heard from the point where the world's will and the great path came into contact. Amidst the corrosive sounds, wisps of smoke were emitted from the point where the two came into contact. They were like bubbles that floated upwards. At this moment, the painful emotions were transmitted through the world's will into the light of heaven and earth. Then, through the light of heaven and earth, it drowned Luo Fan. If Luo Fan was not the master of the light of heaven and earth, and was protected by the light of heaven and earth, the pain alone would have been enough to make him lose his mind for a long time. However, even so, Luo Fan could not help but tremble at this time. His eyes were slightly dazed. This kind of pain was simply too terrifying. In the face of this pain, Luo Fan even felt as if he had become an ordinary person who had been thrown into a blender and stirred crazily. Is the great path going to destroy the world's will at the same time? After a while, when Luo Fan had gotten used to this pain, such a thought flashed through his mind. This pain was the pain of the world's will. It was the endless pain caused by the great path destroying the world's will. This situation was clearly beyond his imagination. After all, the world's will was like the world's will, and the great path was the source of everything in this world. In other words, the world's will could also be considered the great path's will. Under such circumstances, all of the great Tao's actions and decisions could only be confirmed by the will of the world. In this way, it was obvious that it was almost impossible for the great Tao to make the decision to destroy the will of the world. It was like if a person wanted to commit suicide, they would definitely not make a decision that would turn them into a living dead forever to cure their illness. But now, the great path had made such an inconceivable decision. In Luo Fan's opinion, the world's will was simply like the hair on an animal's body to the great path. It seemed as if its existence or not didn't affect it at all. How was it possible for him to react in time? Without waiting for Luo Fan to react, the great Tao's corrosion and damage to the will of the heavens and earth did not stop for even a moment. At this moment, it was as if it was facing an enemy that posed the greatest threat to it. It almost crazily damaged the will of the heavens and earth, causing the sizzling sounds to become even more concentrated. The smoke that was being emitted from the will of the heavens and earth became even more numerous. Perhaps this is the fundamental reason why this world divided a part of its will to delay the arrival of the great calamity. In the end, such a conclusion appeared in Luo Fan's heart, causing an inexplicable bitter smile to appear on his face. Chapter 2430. Luo Fan naturally could not sit by and watch as the world will was constantly being whittled away by the world will. Originally, he planned to first devour the world will, then spend some time to take control of this region of the world, and then modify it to affect the world will. In the end, the world will would open its doors to him. At that point, he would devour the world will, and then the entire world. However, the world will had already taken the initiative to take action. Clearly, there was no more time for him to adjust and modify it step by step. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan clearly only had one choice, which was to immediately start the process that would have taken some time to start, and directly devour the world will. After he made up his mind, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, the net of threads that had been converging towards the light of heaven and earth suddenly reversed its direction. It suddenly turned inward and extended outwards, directly towards the great Tao outside of the will of heaven and earth. Zzzzz. The strange sound paused for a moment, and changed from being used on the world will to being used on the net of threads that was constantly spreading outwards. However, in contrast, the endless smoke that was emitted from the surface of the contact between the world will and the world will started to decrease. Although it was still being produced endlessly, the scale was clearly much smaller. Evidently, the world will was being whittled away by the world will by a lot. In order to achieve this goal, Luo Fan paid a huge price. At this moment, his light of the universe was replacing the world will to withstand the corrosion of the world will, and withstanding the whittling away. The corrosion and whittling away brought about pain that was several times greater than before. It made Luo Fan feel that his soul had been completely drowned by the endless pain. If it was not for the layer of light of the universe, he might have completely lost his mind at this moment. As expected, without the control of the world will, the light of the universe won't be acknowledged by the world will in the end. Sensing the pain from the light of the universe, Luo Fan could not help but think. However, it was clear that even so, he had no intention of giving up at all. Instead, he tried his best to guide the light of heaven and earth to assimilate the part of the great Tao that was enveloped by the web of threads. He was preparing to devour that part of the great Tao. This kind of effort was not enough to directly eliminate the pain transmitted by the light of heaven and earth, but it was enough to weaken the degree of corrosion and assimilation of the silk webs. Although the sizzling sound continued, the range of the sound began to shrink. At least compared to the ratio of the net, it was constantly reducing. This was because the surrounding great Taos within the range of the silk net were gradually assimilated, and the conflict with the silk net was constantly decreasing. Now it was the surrounding great Taos that were constantly eroding the silk net. An indescribable pressure appeared in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, all living beings in this world felt an indescribable anger and hostility welling up from the depths of their hearts. In a trance, they all turned their gazes to the strange network in the sky, which had layers of colors on its own. All of them clearly understood that their greatest mission in life was to destroy this network. Kill the monster that existed in the center of the network. If they couldn't complete this mission, then what awaited them would be eternal damnation. In an instant, countless living beings soared into the sky and charged toward the network. When these living beings made up their minds to respond to the call of their hearts, they realized that they seemed to have received some kind of incredible blessing, and their cultivation realm began to rise at an unimaginable speed. Originally, there was not even a false saint in this world, but now, under that strange blessing, almost all living beings' realms had broken through. False saints appeared one after another. Waves of unparalleled aura were continuously released from those living beings and swept across the entire world. Under normal circumstances, the commotion caused by any false saint or even a false saint's breakthrough would be enough to cause the entire world to tremble and make all living beings marvel for hundreds or even thousands of years. However, now that so many false saints had appeared at the same time, their aura was enough to change the entire aura of this world. It was enough to cause the essence of this world to undergo a subtle shift, but no living being paid attention to them. No living being would be as shocked as they were under normal circumstances in the past. All living beings, be it the false saints themselves or other living beings, had their eyes focused on the center of the network in the sky. They looked at the figure that made their hearts throb and made them feel enmity. In their opinion, only that figure was worth paying attention to. Everything else besides that figure was secondary and not worth mentioning at all. The higher they went, the closer they got to the net of threads, and the clearer they could feel each other. It was as if there was some kind of strange power connecting them together, allowing them to communicate with each other and transfer power to each other. With such a change, the attacking posture of these living beings naturally changed. All kinds of attacks that they had launched without any scruples or were preparing to launch all changed at this moment. They began to cooperate with other living beings and began to work hard to adapt to the attacks of other living beings, strengthening the overall attack as much as possible. With such a small adjustment, the pressure they felt on Luo Fan above them skyrocketed. From a state that was originally not enough for Luo Fan to glance at, it became a state that made him involuntarily turn his gaze over. As Luo Fan turned his gaze over, the endless living beings all felt an indescribable fear emerge from the bottom of their hearts, causing their gazes to become extremely solemn at this moment. Danger! This warning appeared in the hearts of countless living beings at the same time. In this instant, they felt a huge pressure suddenly surging towards them from all directions. Under this kind of pressure, their bodies suddenly froze, and their own power began to quickly dissipate. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, loud explosions suddenly rang out from within the bodies of those living beings. Amidst these explosions, those living beings instantly seemed to have broken free from all shackles and charged towards Luo Fan at an even faster speed. However, in contrast, the eyes of these living beings that originally had some clarity were now completely filled with emptiness and mania. Clearly, they had completely lost their clarity. Are they completely controlled? Looking at these living beings, Luo Fan could not help but frown. He was now becoming more and more curious about the great Tao of this world. It was only natural that the great Tao could affect living beings. Not to mention affecting living beings, it wouldn't be strange even if he could completely control living beings. The reason why Luo Fan felt that the great Tao in front of him was extremely strange was that this great Tao's method of controlling the living beings in this world did not seem like a normal great Tao. Instead, it seemed like a strange will was controlling everything from behind. Could it be that there's some kind of existence controlling this world? This thought surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. With this thought, his expression could not help but become more and more solemn. When this fragment of his entered this world had just been constructed, and there were not many living beings in the entire world. It could be said that from the birth of this world until now, he had seen everything that had happened. Under such circumstances, if there was still some kind of existence that could surpass his control and carry out a large-scale operation on this world, or even control the entire world, how could he endure this? Various thoughts flashed through his mind, and the various major processes that this world had experienced from the beginning until now went through his mind. Indeed, it's extremely likely that there's some kind of living beings will controlling this world from behind. With this thought in mind, his eyes narrowed, and a sharp light shot out from them. If there really was some kind of living beings will controlling everything in this world, including the world's will, then all the previous doubts could clearly be explained. If the world's will was autonomous, it was hard for him to imagine that it would split itself into the world to delay the arrival of the world's great tribulation. It was even harder to imagine that the world's great Tao would take the initiative to erase the world's will at this moment in order to erase all possible dangers that could threaten this world. As for the many living beings in this world now, the very strange changes that seem to be controlled by a living being behind the scenes could not be explained. Who is it? With this thought in mind, the light of heaven and earth trembled slightly. Waves of his concept God's power began to swarm in all directions along the silk network, and fiercely penetrated the outside great Tao, causing the great Tao that was affected by this concept God's power to inexplicably become chaotic at this moment. A turbid color began to appear in those chaotic areas. Even the normal spacetime and the normal laws were disturbed at this moment. The direction that those living beings were pouncing towards was clearly the focus of Luo Fan's attention. At this moment, most of the concept God's power was pouncing towards those living beings. For the great Tao itself, these concept God's power might only have the effect of disturbing it. At most, it would make the color of the great Tao become turbid. However, for the living beings in this world, the effect of these concept God's power was obviously not that small. At this moment, the instant they encountered the concept God's power, they did not even have the ability to resist and were directly erased by the concept God's power. They didn't even have the ability to scream. The concept God's power was extremely mysterious. After erasing those living beings, it did not immediately calm down. Instead, it traced back to the source and used the various subtle connections of those living beings to spread towards the existence behind those living beings that was making those living beings pounce towards Luo Fan. Under this guidance, most of the concept God's power directly collided with the surrounding Great Tao. They produced a strange reaction with the Great Tao and caused some sort of chaos before disappearing without a trace. However, there was also a small portion of the concept God's power that directly seeped into the Great Tao and spread towards a certain direction. It seemed to be guided by a certain source and kept condensing towards that source. Seeing this, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. "Looks like I found it." His gaze traced the direction of the concept God's power. If it was just one living being, this tracing would naturally be meaningless. After all, the probability of a small number of concept God's power spreading was too high. Who could be sure that the direction of the concept God's power spreading wasn't due to all sorts of accidents or coincidences? However, there were simply too many living beings now. It could be counted in the trillions. With so many living beings, even if only 1/10,000th of them had concept God's power that could trace back to the target, the number would still be counted in the trillions. With so many concept God's power seeping towards a certain location from all directions, there was no need to wait for the concept God's power to travel too far. As long as one could see the direction of the concept God's power, one would be able to determine where the existence that was guiding the concept God's power was after a slight combination. At this moment, Luo Fan had already focused his gaze towards a certain location in the distance through the guidance of the countless concept God's power. It was a place that was extremely deep in the Great Tao, and it felt like it had even reached the end of the Great Tao. That place seemed very normal at first glance, just like an ordinary Grand Tao. It contained boundless profundities of the Grand Tao, boundless profundities of laws, and countless principles of the combination of matter, energy, time, and space. However, upon closer inspection, one would realize that the combination of the various mysteries seemed a little strange. Vaguely, there seemed to be some characteristic of turning nothingness into reality. Within the countless mysteries and principles, there was a hidden existence that truly existed, an existence that was incompatible with the Great Tao. It's there. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not know that he had found the target he was looking for? If Luo Fan relied solely on himself, it would naturally be extremely difficult to cross the entire Great Tao and rush to that strange location. It might even be close to impossible. However, Luo Fan wasn't alone now. Chapter 2431. Luo Fan's heart was slightly moved. His body was directly wrapped in the light of the heavens and the earth, and he quickly rushed towards the end of the road. As he charged, the surrounding Great Tao naturally reacted violently. Endless obstructions appeared from all directions and engulfed the light of the world. They frantically stirred and eroded the light of the world, doing their best to corrode and assimilate the light of the world. However, it was a pity that the light of the world was still surrounded by countless tiny nets. As the light of the world moved, the nets moved as well. As the nets moved, they naturally moved along with a portion of the Great Tao that was enveloped by the nets. Although these Great Tao had already been assimilated by the light of the world, they were still Great Tao. In essence, they were still similar to the boundless Great Tao. However, the Great Tao didn't have much of a conflict with the surrounding Great Tao. As a result, the paths became a buffer between the light of the universe and the path. As a result, the resistance the light of the universe faced when it moved was many times less than normal. In this way, the speed at which the light of heaven and earth was moving was much faster than when it was moving in the Great Tao. Due to all these factors, it only took a few days for the light of the world to traverse the endless distance and arrive at the place that was created by countless mysteries. When the light of the world arrived and the net made contact with that place, a huge rumble suddenly erupted from that strange place. Terrifying shock waves constantly spread out, one after another. The surrounding Great Tao seemed to have turned into a raging sea, unable to maintain its original calmness. A turbid luster constantly appeared in the place where the shock waves spread out, turning the clear Great Tao into a yellow river. Compared to the other regions that had a strong conflict with the light of the world but ultimately couldn't stop the assimilation of the light of the world, this strange place's resistance to the light of the world was extraordinarily strong. Under this kind of resistance, the silk nets seemed to have collided with an unbreakable and sturdy barrier. Every single one of them bounced back the moment they collided. In the blink of an eye, the entire silk net began to spread in all directions from that spot. It's indeed extraordinary. Seeing this, Luo Fan revealed a look of admiration and curiosity. This strange place was rooted in the Great Tao, but it surpassed it. It felt as if it was a plant that had grown out of the ground and was completely different from the soil. Although he couldn't directly invade this strange place, it didn't mean that Luo Fan couldn't do anything about it. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The countless threads from the light of the world went around the strange place and began to wrap around the strange place. They began to try their best to assimilate all the great Taos around the strange place. Even though the strange place influence had caused the surrounding Great Tao to undergo subtle changes and made it more resistant to the Great Tao than usual, it was still. In the end, it was still the Great Tao, and it was still fundamentally different from the strange place. As a result, the Great Tao would still be assimilated bit by bit and corroded bit by bit until it was completely controlled by the light of the world. As the corrosion was complete, the Great Tao's connection with the surrounding Great Tao was directly cut off. It was about to be isolated and helpless. At this moment, a tentacle suddenly reached out from the strange place. The tentacle seemed to be real yet incorporeal. It seemed to be extremely large yet extremely small. It seemed to be extremely fast yet extremely slow. After it reached out, with a slight tremble, it had already thrown the endless threads around it into chaos. The surrounding silk net that was about to completely cut off the connection between this strange place and the surrounding Great Tao was instantly broken, allowing it to re-establish its connection with the other Great Tao in the surroundings. Seeing this, Luo Fan was shocked. It was obvious that the existence hidden in that strange place had finally made its move. Once it made a move, it revealed a part of its strength. There was no need to mention how powerful this existence was. If it wasn't this powerful, how could it have disturbed the net formed by the light of the world? How could it re-establish the connection between this strange existence and the surrounding Great Tao? However, it wasn't as powerful as the worst-case scenario that Luo Fan had expected. Originally, Luo Fan had thought that the existence might be at the level of a true saint. However, although the power displayed by the existence in front of him was powerful, it hadn't reached the level of a true saint. At the very least, if it was a true saint-level technique, with Luo Fan's current foundation and eyesight, he wouldn't be able to see many traces of it. He wouldn't even be able to understand it. However, when the existence in front of him made a move, he could sense a little bit of the profoundness it displayed. Just this alone was obviously enough. With a thought, endless light shot out from Luo Fan's body and formed a three-legged round cauldron in the void. Then, it fiercely smashed towards the strange place. The light that formed the three-legged round cauldron was none other than the countless divine abilities of concepts that he had condensed from the world of laws. When they formed the three-legged round cauldron, they reconstructed and sublimated these divine abilities. Not only did they form a complete whole, but the power of each divine ability was also enhanced beyond imagination. This made their overall power more than 10 million times stronger than when they were stacked normally. When the three-legged round cauldron formed by countless light collided with the strange place, the originally messy web naturally gathered towards the three-legged round cauldron. It was as if countless threads of smoke had grown out of the three-legged round cauldron. They protected the three-legged round cauldron as it fiercely smashed towards the strange place. As it smashed down, the great Tao that had already been partially assimilated began to stir wildly, erupting with earth-shattering power. It was unknown how many phantoms of heaven and earth were born in this chaos in an instant. They released supreme power that could destroy heaven and earth as they fiercely blocked the three-legged round cauldron. Boom, 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 boom. The three-legged round cauldron was like a hot knife through butter. It completely crushed the countless phantoms of heaven and earth formed by the great Tao. It was as if it was crushing layers of eggshells. With such an irresistible force, the three-legged round cauldron quickly arrived above the strange place and fiercely suppressed it. Under Luo Fan's refinement, the three-legged round cauldron had already displayed its suppressive effect to the limit. It could almost be called the representative of suppression, the manifestation of suppression. At this moment, under the support of boundless concept divine abilities, the three-legged round cauldron that seemed to have materialized suppressed the strange place. Its momentum could be imagined. It was so much so that before the three-legged cauldron came into contact with the mysterious area, the suppressive aura had already caused the mysterious area to start to crumble. The countless mysteries that lingered on it had already started to crumble, causing the mysterious area to start to tremble. The endless great Tao outside began to churn at this moment. All the living beings in this world felt as if their privacy had been violated. They felt enraged and frantically charged towards this region. They were like iron shavings attracted by a magnet, forming an extremely mysterious pattern. At this moment, another tentacle stretched out from the strange place and faced the three-legged round cauldron in an extremely strange and contradictory manner. With regards to the appearance of the tentacles, Luo Fan had already expected it. At this moment, it was naturally impossible for him to let the tentacles easily destroy his attack like how he did with the light of the heavens and earth. At that moment, the three-legged cauldron trembled slightly and its power surged. Boundless profound fluctuations began to radiate from its body. Faintly, there seemed to be worlds appearing one after another. They overlapped and collided with the tentacle. Chi-chi-chi-chi-chi, countless crisp sounds rang out the moment the shadows came into contact with the tentacle. Following that, the countless illusions of the world completely collapsed and disappeared from this contact. However, the collapse of these worlds was not without any effect. Although it had already collapsed, the tentacle had also encountered great obstruction during this process. The feeling of lifting something heavy as if it was light disappeared along with the collapse. Countless strange images began to appear from the tentacle. The tentacle seemed to have transformed into hundreds of millions of tentacles in an instant. A large number of shadows swayed as they closed in on the three-legged round cauldron and wrapped around it. This kind of attack seemed even more mysterious and grand, but in reality, it was many times weaker than the tentacle that had rushed out without any smoke or fire, stirring up chaos and wiping out everything. Luo Fan's expression didn't change in the slightest in the face of the countless tentacles rushing over. With a thought, the three-legged cauldron's power was released, and a large amount of suppressive power erupted with a loud rumble. Crack! 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 At this moment, a huge roar erupted from the countless tentacles, and the countless tentacles began to collapse rapidly. In the end, all the shadows turned into one and collided with the three-legged round cauldron. After that, The tentacles started to collapse swiftly, and the three-legged cauldron followed the collapse of the tentacle as it ferociously descended towards the mysterious location below. In the blink of an eye, it had already surpassed the length of the tentacle and smashed heavily onto the mysterious location. Boundless mysteries of the grand Tao, space-time, and laws erupted from the strange place and shot madly in all directions. However, the strange place was unable to resist the suppression of the three-legged round cauldron at all. Under the suppression of the three-legged round cauldron, its structure began to collapse, and the existence within it was revealed. It was an existence that Luo Fan's fragment was extremely familiar with. It was an existence that looked extremely similar to the creature that had been reincarnated from the will of the world. In the eyes of the world, it was an extremely perfect creature that had the form of a natural Tao constitution. In other words, it was an extremely strange creature that looked like an octopus. In the eyes of the world's aesthetics, this octopus creature was obviously extremely perfect. Whether it was its tentacles, the bumps on its body, the distance between its eyes, the color of its eyes, or even the specks of mucus on its body, they were all so beautiful and perfect. From the perspective of cultivation, this creature's body structure was extremely compatible with the essence of the world. If it were to cultivate with such a body structure, then perhaps it would be faster and smoother than the creature that had been reincarnated from the will of the world. If there was any other creature in the world that could possess such a perfect body structure, then Luo Fan could only think of one. That was the creator of the world. As the creator of this world, no matter what kind of structure his body was, no matter how strange or mediocre his body form was, in the world he created, his image would definitely be the most compatible with the world and the most suitable for cultivation, the innate Taoist physique. All other creatures born in the world, no matter what their own thoughts were, as long as their form and body structure were different from this existence, then they would deviate from the way of the world and deviate from the requirements of the natural Tao constitution. Only such an existence could exude such a strong sense of perfection at this time. Only such an existence could make Luo Fan's image, which went against his sense of aesthetics, completely unable to find any flaws. How is this possible? If it's the creator of the world, how can it be so weak? When Luo Fan saw this scene, a feeling of disbelief flashed through his heart. The living being before him did indeed match the image of the creator of this world. However, there was a world of difference between the strength of this living being and the creator of this world. As the creator of the perfect world, normally speaking, it should be an incredible existence like the true saint. Only such an existence could truly stabilize a perfect world in a state of chaos. Only then could a perfect world truly obtain the potential to become a great world. Chapter 2432. At this moment, the octopus-like creature's body trembled, and the many tentacles on its body flashed, instantly tearing apart the wreckage that could still hold on. It was so straightforward that it was as if the surrounding structure was not something that could exist in the great Tao. Instead, it was like a fragile structure made of plasticine that had yet to be fixed. After completely tearing it apart, the tentacles did not stop immediately. Instead, they went one step further and directly wrapped around the three-legged cauldron that Luo Fan had formed from the combination of many concept theurgy. Although the three-legged cauldron had already completely destroyed the strange place, leaving only some wreckage here, it was ultimately only a concept theurgy. Completing such a great undertaking was not easy for it. At the very least, it was not a great undertaking that could be completed without paying a price. At this moment, although the three-legged cauldron still maintained its structure and was still in that extremely mysterious and wonderful appearance, it was already many times weaker than before. Perhaps the three-legged cauldron could barely fight against these tentacles for a while. However, facing these tentacles now, the three-legged cauldron did not even resist. The tentacles had already cut into it, and with a slight tremble, it completely collapsed and was annihilated. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable danger pouncing at him. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had a grave expression on his face. Although he thought that the creature in front of him was weaker than he had imagined, that was only when compared to a true divine. As a matter of fact, this creature's strength was still extremely shocking. At the very least, compared to the current Luo Fan, it was much stronger. Facing such an existence, how could he not take it seriously? At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The light of the world around him began to surge, and the tentacles condensed from the light of the world rushed out of the vortex. They brazenly charged at the creature, and fiercely stabbed at it. At this moment, the creature's many tentacles reacted at the same time. As they moved, countless mysterious lights flashed on the tentacles. Under the influence of the tentacle, the surrounding Great Tao began to undergo various indescribable changes. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into countless mysterious threads, faintly outlining a chaotic cloud that fiercely collided with the tentacle formed by the light of the universe. Under this collision, the chaotic clouds formed by the threads completely collapsed, and the tentacles formed by the light of the world also completely collapsed under this impact. However, the tentacle did not stop after that. Instead, it shook slightly and turned around again, charging toward the vortex-like light of heaven and earth once more. As it charged, the entire Great Tao began to surge, and the entire world trembled. All the rules and laws between the heavens and earth, all time and space, all matter and energy, seemed to come to life at this moment. From all over the world, they began to condense towards the location of the tentacle, forming an extremely terrifying pressure that crushed towards the light of the world. At this moment, crackling sounds came from the countless threads distributed above the light of the world, causing the threads to begin to deform in a strange manner. The entire silk net released countless mysterious lights as it changed shape. The light that could originally only appear at the edge of the silk net, the erosion of the light of the world, had already penetrated the surface barrier under this pressure. Like long needles, they ruthlessly stabbed into the depths of the silk net. In the face of this change, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. He sent out a will, and the light of the world naturally responded. The extremely vast silk net began to tremble subtly. As it trembled, the Great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net was also mobilized. Endless power was released from its body and began to collide with the endless power that was crushing towards it from the outside. In terms of strength alone, the power released by the Great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net was naturally far inferior to the power that was crushing towards it from the outside. However, the essence of this power was so similar to the power that was crushing towards it from the outside. This similarity caused the power from the outside to involuntarily calm down the moment it came into contact with the power inside. Originally, 100 portions of the power could only exert a portion of the effect at most. However, even so, Luo Fan still felt that the light of the world had suffered an irresistible impact. The light of the world, along with the Great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net, were instantly sent flying like a baseball. Their bodies flew straight back, leaving a long vacuum mark in the void. At this moment, the octopus-like life form had already rushed out of the strange wreckage. Its figure was as relaxed as an ordinary octopus in the sea. With a few waves of its tentacles, it had already left behind countless afterimages. From all directions, it rushed towards Luo Fan in a way that transcended time and space. At this moment, Luo Fan found that he had suffered attacks that spanned from the past, present, and future. This kind of attack was so dense that he could only face it head-on in order to have a chance to block it. At the same time, he also felt that the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes were also suffering similar attacks. However, compared to the irresistible attack that covered the past, present, and future of the reality plane, the attack that one's corresponding existence in other planes suffered was not so absolute. In the face of these attacks, the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes had their own reactions. After dodging or facing it head-on, the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes easily escaped and were not attacked by the octopus-like life form at this moment. Because the laws in the different planes were different, the results of the attacks would naturally appear at different times. Before the attacks in the real world had completely come to an end, the results of many planes in the other planes had already been completely determined. Therefore, when the tentacles reached the top of his head, Luo Fan was already completely relieved. With the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes, even if he completely failed in the real world and all traces of his existence were erased, he would still be unscathed since he no longer had any worries. He naturally felt more at ease. At this moment, he raised his hand and drew in the void. Boundless light appeared in his hand, forming countless sharp blades that shot towards the endless tentacles. Naturally, these sharp blades were not ordinary blades, and their attacks were not just ordinary cutting attacks. Each blade contained countless concept abilities, and the attack characteristics of each blade were also different due to the different concept abilities. In the end, these blades possessed various effects that ordinary creatures and cultivators could not even imagine. For a moment, the countless tentacles were either devoured by some strange space-time, wrapped by various runes, turned illusory, became extremely heavy, or changed into all sorts of strange forms in the blink of an eye. The attacks of the countless tentacles had been completely disintegrated, however. This seemed to be nothing to the life form. At this moment, the life form that had escaped from that strange place seemed to have become the center of the entire world, the ruler of the great Tao. Even in the face of these profound attacks, his expression did not change at all. As his body trembled, everything in the world seemed to be stirred up along with him. The tentacles that had been subdued by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth seemed to have been cut by some strange blades. They broke away from the light of heaven and earth bit by bit, and returned to the endless river of the great Tao in the outside world. Of course, this was just the background. At this moment, the life form's attack on Luo Fan had yet to subside. Its body emitted a strange brilliance, and an increasingly powerful repulsive force acted on the light of heaven and earth, as well as on Luo Fan's body. It was as if the light of heaven and earth had turned into ordinary light, and there was no special power at all. Immediately after, a tentacle penetrated the barrier of the great Tao in an extremely mysterious manner, and quickly shot towards Luo Fan. The number of tentacles was naturally tens of thousands of times less than the countless tentacles from before. However, the pressure that this tentacle brought to Luo Fan was completely incomparable to that of the countless tentacles from before. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if he was facing the attack of a supreme true saint. It was as if everything in the universe had become his enemy, and everything was being crushed in various ways according to the other party's will. And no matter how he reacted, no matter what method he used to resist, he seemed to be completely unable to break away from this tentacle, and he could not avoid the attack exerted by this tentacle. As the tentacle approached, Luo Fan had a feeling that death was constantly approaching. He could even vaguely see endless space-time hidden in the countless suction cups on the tentacle. There was also an unknown amount of unimaginable power that was constantly brewing, as if it was ready to be released at any time. And the trajectory of this tentacle across the great Tao made him feel as if he had seen it in Pangu's primordial spirit, the moment when Pangu split the heavens and the earth. At this moment, the universe seemed to no longer exist, and all his thoughts and all the scope of his vision were already left with this tentacle. Poof! With a soft sound, this tentacle had already penetrated the barrier of the light of heaven and earth, and directly blasted onto Luo Fan's body. And Luo Fan's body completely collapsed at this moment, as if he was just a human figure condensed from smoke. At this moment, the octopus-like creature murmured, "Did I succeed?" At this moment, he already looked extremely miserable. More than 90% of the tentacles around his body had been broken, and there was not a trace of vitality in his body, as if he had just struggled out of death. As for the power of his body, the brilliance in his eyes, and the perfection and power that originally lingered around his body, not a single bit remained. From this state, one could tell at a glance how great a price he had paid to unleash that move from before. However, he clearly really had some kind of relationship with the creator of the world. At this moment, everything in this world, whether it was the great Tao, laws, time, space, or material energy, was constantly gathering towards him and continuously surging into his body, replenishing his consumption and healing all kinds of strange injuries on his body. If it was a normal cultivator, even if his entire body collapsed and was completely erased with this kind of replenishment, he would probably recover completely in an instant. However, this was not the case for this creature at this moment at all. After receiving such replenishment and so many conveniences from this world, this creature just completely absorbed all of them without any changes to his body at all. Perhaps there were changes, but the extent of the changes were clearly too small, and the speed was too slow. It seemed as if there were no changes at all. From this, it could be seen just how severe the price he had paid just now was. If I erase him, this world should have more time for me to recover. But why would such an enemy of the world appear? Could it be that I violated some sort of Great Tribulation's rules by delaying the Great Tribulation? The octopus-like creature suddenly looked up at the sky. His gaze was distant, as if he could see through layers of barriers and see some supreme existence beyond the world. The creature murmured, and that tentacle had already been retracted. Immediately afterward, his body squirmed, and spots of blood reappeared on his body. Although his eyes were still dim, his figure had at least somewhat recovered to its original perfect state. Evidently, after recovering a bit of his mental strength, this creature could already readjust his figure. Looking down at the devastated world below, the creature sighed again and hatefully said, "Billions of years of effort turned into bubbles overnight. It's a pity that he's already dead. Otherwise, I'll definitely torture him properly to vent the hatred in my heart." As he spoke, he swung his tentacles and was about to turn around and return to the origin of the great Tao to reconstruct a strange place to contain himself. However, the moment he turned around, he suddenly sensed something. His eyes narrowed and uncertainty filled his eyes. Chapter 24:33. He's not dead? At this moment, a shocking thought flashed through the creature's mind. After all, he had clearly erased all traces of Luo Fan just now. Normally speaking, even the many other creatures in this world should have forgotten about him. This strange light that was completely rooted in Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth, should naturally dissipate with him. Judging from this, there was clearly only one possibility: Luo Fan was not dead. What he had sensed before, the signs that all traces of existence had been completely erased, was nothing more than his own misconception. After discovering this, how could the creature dare to be careless? Even though he was already dead tired, and even though it was extremely difficult for him to mobilize his power, he still forced himself to summon his strength. His many tentacles danced and stirred up the surrounding great Tao. With a momentum that could destroy heaven and earth, he ruthlessly smashed towards the light of heaven and earth. With this smash, all the power in the world seemed to have been mobilized. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth seemed to be unable to withstand this kind of power. Its structure began to distort violently, and the net that had spread out from the light of heaven and earth was instantly forced back. It was about to be completely pressed back into the light of heaven and earth. At this stage, the great Tao's assimilation and erosion of the net had almost stopped. It was as if all the power of the great Tao had been completely converted into pressure on the net, and it wanted to completely erase the net from its roots. In the creature's eyes, the reason why Luo Fan was not completely dead was clearly because of this extremely strange light that could even rival the will of heaven and earth and the great Tao. In this way, the creature's target was very obvious if it wanted to completely kill Luo Fan. The entire world had originally gradually eased up and was about to gradually return to peace. However, following the will of this living being, not only did the entire world once again sink into the violence and terror from before, it even went a step further, causing all living beings to feel that a certain vital existence within them had been brazenly extracted. They seemed to have become incomparably empty, faintly feeling as if they had turned into an empty shell. Under this pressure, the light of heaven and earth rapidly shrunk. The vortex gradually lost its form and returned to its original form, turning back into a living creature. It kept changing and moving, as if it wanted to find a certain form, but couldn't find the answer. As for the countless threads, they had been completely pushed back into the light of the world. From the looks of it, the situation was extremely dire. However, this change was not entirely a bad thing for the light of heaven and earth. In fact, from a certain point of view, this was a great thing. There was no other reason. As the silk net was pressed into the light of heaven and earth, the world will of this world was also completely enveloped by the silk net. In other words, this terrifying pressure seemed to have completely pushed back the silk net, causing the light of heaven and earth to suffer serious damage. However, this was only on the surface. In reality, the light of heaven and earth had benefited greatly. It had originally had no time or energy to do the work of devouring the world will, but it had been completed in an extremely short period of time. Of course, this was clearly not a big deal for that living being. To that living being, the world will was clearly not too important. Even if the world will was completely devoured, it would not hesitate as long as it could quickly wipe out Luo Fan. Therefore, it did not regret its actions at all, causing the light of heaven and earth to devour the world will even faster. Instead, it further strengthened its control over the power, and strengthened the gathering of the power of the entire world. At this moment, every inch of space and time in the entire world seemed to be grabbed and pulled by invisible hands, frantically compressing towards the center. Due to this terrifying pulling effect, the boundaries of the world became blurry, and the originally clear structure at the boundaries became even more chaotic. Boundless great calamity baleful chi from the outside world crazily attacked the boundaries that had suddenly become weak, causing loud rumbles to ring out from all over the boundaries of the world. The rumbles were extremely strange and massive. When they reached the ears of the living beings, they felt like they were personally witnessing the end of the world. They felt like everything they had was going to collapse in the next moment, and the foundation of their existence would disappear in an instant. An indescribable fear emerged from the bottom of the living beings' hearts. They kept pouring into the Great Tao, gradually affecting the Great Tao and the various mysteries of the Great Tao. It even caused the expression of the living being, who was suspected to be the creator of the world, to change slightly. He had long known that the living beings would affect the foundation of the world, and even affect him. However, the extent of this influence still exceeded his expectations. He even felt his mind suddenly become hazy. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth flashed slightly, and suddenly turned from its originally extremely solid and real state to an illusory one. The boundless mysteries of the Great Tao rapidly changed at this moment, wanting to trace the changes of the light of heaven and earth, and continue suppressing it. However, it was a pity that the mysteries of the Great Tao itself were burdened by the living being. That living being had the will of a living being and the way of thinking of a living being. When fighting with other living beings, he could be more agile and more targeted, thus saving him more effort. However, a living being was a living being, and a living being's will was a living being's will. No matter how powerful he was, before he reached the true divine stage, there was still a gap between him and the world's will and the Great Tao's own autonomous reaction. With such a gap in the background, how could he react as quickly as the Great Tao when faced with the changes of the light of heaven and earth that had reached the level of complexity of the world's will? In other words, if the living being did not exist, he could only rely on the Great Tao itself to respond according to the situation and react accordingly. then, at this moment, the changes of the light of heaven and earth would definitely not be able to escape the Great Tao's control. He would still be suppressed by the Great Tao and would not be able to escape its suppression. However, after the existence of this living being, the changes that surpassed the limits of a living being's reaction speed caused the living being to be at a loss. As a result, the Great Tao was also unable to do anything to it. In the end, it easily escaped the Great Tao's suppression, allowing the boundless Great Tao to instantly pass through the light of heaven and earth, as if it was passing through an illusion and violently collided in the middle. Of course, the Great Tao was also constantly changing during this process. It traced the changes of the light of heaven and earth in an attempt to come into contact with the true form of the light of heaven and earth. However, it was a pity that the light of heaven and earth was also constantly changing. Because of the living being's burden on the Great Tao, the light of heaven and earth's changes were much faster than the Great Tao's changes. Hence, although the Great Tao was chasing after it, it was always one step ahead, causing the Great Tao to be unable to do anything to it. At this moment, a figure slowly appeared within the light of heaven and earth. He sat quietly with his legs crossed, and his expression was calm and collected. It was Luo Fan. Compared to before, Luo Fan no longer felt any urgency. It was as if he had seen through everything and grasped everything. How is this possible? The living being could not help but be dumbfounded when it saw Luo Fan appear there. Although it had already discovered that Luo Fan might not be completely dead, it had only suspected that he was not completely dead. It had never thought that Luo Fan would actually be completely unharmed. In fact, he even seemed to be a lot more confident than before. This situation had already overturned his worldview. He felt as if his understanding of the world and his understanding of cultivation had been completely overturned. So the weakness is so obvious. I actually didn't notice it at all before. A strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he looked at the light of heaven and earth that was changing freely. There was a sense of realization and helplessness on his face. The realization was that he already knew how to defeat this living being, defeat the world, and even devour it. The helplessness was that this method had actually been placed in front of him a long time ago, but he had only discovered it now, when he had died once and relied on the connection between many other planes and reality to resurrect. At this moment, he no longer controlled the light of heaven and earth to fight like before. Instead, he sent his target to the world's will within the light of heaven and earth. Afterwards, he began to wait quietly, allowing the light of heaven and earth to react naturally and choose how to change, as well as how to reach his target. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth shook slightly. Circles of fluctuations were released from his body, continuously spreading in all directions. As this spread, the fluctuations gradually condensed. Unknowingly, they had already transformed into an indescribable state, forming circles after circles of concentric circles that resembled a network, wrapping the wider and wider paths within these concentric circles. With this change, the paths that were wrapped within the concentric circles seemed to have been cut out from the complete path. Pieces of them became isolated and helpless, and the materialized fluctuations began to continuously erode, assimilate, and devour them. In the end, they turned into the fluctuations' nourishment, causing the fluctuations to strengthen and expand once again, enveloping even more paths within them before devouring them. How dare you! The living being turned pale with fright when it saw this. It released its will and tried its best to control the paths, wanting to break the strange network formed by the fluctuations and link all the paths together again. As long as it could do this, the paths would be protected by the complete path and would not be devoured so easily. However, it was a pity that the network of fluctuations was also constantly producing all sorts of indescribable and unimaginable changes. It seemed to completely ignore the resistance of the paths. With just the various subtle changes, it had already broken free from the resistance of the paths. It was not affected at all as it devoured the paths at its own pace. At the same time, the light of heaven and earth was also dodging the attacks and suppression of the paths. However, similar to the fluctuations, the light of heaven and earth was similarly unfazed by the attacks and suppression of the paths. It could not have dealt with them more easily. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he watched this development. He slowly closed his eyes and immersed his mind in the light of heaven and earth. He began to follow the process of the light of heaven and earth as it absorbed the paths, constantly comprehending the mysteries and principles revealed in the process. Changes similar to the previous world appeared in the light of heaven and earth. Countless broken lines gradually appeared within the light of heaven and earth. They quickly swam about, trying their best to link together and form a more orderly, grander, and mysterious pattern. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan. After devouring the will of heaven and earth, he no longer had any worries. Coupled with the fact that he had discovered the weaknesses of the paths, he did not need to do anything else. Naturally, there was no need for him to waste any more time. He naturally wanted to obtain as many benefits as possible from the process of the light of heaven and earth devouring the paths. Endless mysteries and principles continued to fuse into his heart, gradually turning into all kinds of subtle comprehensions. Bit by bit, they perfected his world-view of laws, transforming his world-view of laws, allowing his world-view of laws to slowly approach the true sage level. In the process of comprehending, time seemed to have lost all meaning. After an unknown period of time, perhaps it had already been 1,000,000,000,000 years, or perhaps it had only been a few days. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt that the comprehensions that were constantly being transmitted from the light of heaven and earth had gradually disappeared. "It's over." With a slight jolt in his heart, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes and looked outside. He could not help but smile when he saw what was happening. This was because, just as he had expected, there was only a thin layer of the great Tao left in this world. This layer was tightly wrapped around the surface of the living being's body, vaguely forming a protective circle. At this time, the creature was looking at Luo Fan with an incomparable shock, fear, and hatred in its eyes, as well as the ball of light on the surface of his body, which had been enlarged by who knew how many tens of thousands of times. It felt as if it could blot out the sky and cover the earth. With a slight calculation, Luo Fan knew that millions of years had passed since he started to comprehend the boundless profundities and principles revealed by the light of the heavens and the earth. After knowing the time, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. "I didn't expect you to not react after such a long time. It seems that even if you're related to the creator of this world, you're probably just a trace of aura." Chapter 2434. Luo Fan naturally did not have any intention of explaining to the creature's confusion. Even though his light of heaven and earth had turned into an inescapable net at this moment, it had surrounded the creature along with the layer of Tao that covered its body. The situation had developed to the point where even if the creature reacted, it would not be able to fight back. Suddenly, the creature's mind cleared up, and it suddenly had a flash of inspiration. It understood just how foolish it had been for all these years, and the confusion on its face suddenly turned into deep regret. "What have I done?" he muttered. His figure shrank, and the tentacles that had been inserted into the great Tao and were controlling the great Tao to fight against Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth were completely withdrawn. As it made this choice, the bit of Tao that had been suppressed to the point of being unable to resist at all seemed to have suddenly recovered its vitality, and it suddenly underwent countless mysterious changes. It actually managed to withstand the light of heaven and earth's inescapable net, and it faintly felt like it was about to become independent and completely separate from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. "Looks like it really has understood its mistake." Seeing this, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly, and he suddenly smiled faintly. The changes in the bit of Tao that remained in front of him had clearly broken free from the creature's will, and the various reactions of the Tao itself once again dominated the various responses it should make against its enemies. When the creature saw the power that erupted from the Tao after it completely let go, it could not help but feel even more regretful. This was because at this moment, the power that the Tao released was at least 10,000 times stronger than when it was under its control. Even the strange light outside, which had made him run for his life in the past millions of years and had cut the originally vast great Tao into this tiny bit of light, couldn't suppress it for a while. This situation clearly showed that its guess just now was correct. When it controlled the Tao to fight against the strange light, it did not increase the power of the Tao at all. On the contrary, it dragged down the Tao and became its weakness. If it had realized this earlier, the situation would definitely not have developed to this state. Unfortunately, it's too late. The creature sighed bitterly as it looked at Luo Fan with an unwilling gaze. Luo Fan smiled faintly despite being stared at like this. At the end of the day, it's because you look down on this world and don't have a clear understanding of your own position. If I was able to recognize this, I would have thrown myself into the cycle of reincarnation in this world, and I would definitely not have made such a mistake. After all these years of fighting, Luo Fan had gradually understood the nature of this creature through Tonggue's deduction of its behavior. In reality, this creature must have an extremely close relationship with the true saint who created this world. This close connection caused this creature to be infected with the mentality of a true sage. As a result, when he looked at the world around him, he naturally had a feeling of looking down on everything. This sort of overlooking caused him to not even trust the grand Daos of the world, much less the will of the world itself. That was why he was able to divide the will of the world, as well as interfere with the great Tao. It was actually not difficult to reverse this sort of overlooking. All it needed was for this creature to personally witness the power of this world and its mysteries. If he wanted to do this even more easily, he only needed to throw himself into the cycle of reincarnation and reincarnate as a creature of this world. Then, he would naturally be able to experience his own insignificance, as well as the vastness and power of the world. However, it was clear that the creature did not manage to do this. All this while, he had been observing the world from a transcendent point of view, controlling the development of the world, and even dividing the will of the world itself. After doing all these things, the feeling of looking down on the world naturally did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger with the passage of time. In the end, it led to the current outcome. It made the creature make a mistake that could have been avoided with just a slight twist of its head. It could even be considered a low-level mistake. Indeed, in the end, I still can't recognize myself. The creature sighed. Now, can you tell me who you are? Luo Fan looked at the creature and asked plainly. The creature only smiled. Do you think I'll tell you? You're currently devouring my world and destroying my existence. No, I'm only going through my own tribulation, Luo Fan said calmly. His gaze was distant, as if it contained endless secrets and principles. The creature shuddered. It looked at Luo Fan with a bewildered gaze. What do you mean? It had countless doubts in its heart and couldn't help but ask. I don't believe that you don't feel anything at all. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The creature fell silent. Although Luo Fan didn't explain what he was referring to, the creature already knew what he was referring to. Moreover, after knowing this, it also understood that the strange feeling it had ever since the world was created wasn't an illusion. Is this world really just a clone? I'm also just a duplicate? It sighed. Although it was a question, its tone was full of certainty. Luo Fan only smiled. He didn't admit it, nor did he deny it. However, his attitude clearly represented many things. The creature bitterly smiled, and a look of realization appeared on its face. It was as if it had achieved great enlightenment. So that's how it is. No wonder the memories of the past don't feel real. I'm just a wisp of a true divine's aura, but my essence is so much worse than a true divine's. So it's all because I'm just a forced clone. The creature sighed. Its body gradually emitted an indescribable brilliance. This brilliance was so strange and mysterious. Even the surrounding great Tao seemed to be affected by this light. Under this light, it began to distort in a strange way. As this distortion occurred, the great Tao seemed to become more real, as if it had lost some kind of external illusion. Under this change, the great Tao's ability to resist the light of heaven and earth outside began to weaken rapidly. The light of heaven and earth began to suppress the great Tao again. It completely suppressed the great Tao. It looked like it was about to completely devour the great Tao and make it a part of the light of heaven and earth. However, the creature didn't care about this at all. It merely raised its many tentacles and looked at the brilliance emitted from them. There seemed to be endless information flashing through its eyes. In the end, at a certain moment, his body trembled slightly, and his octopus-like body completely collapsed, turning into an indescribable aura. Under the wrapping of the great path, it was like an extremely thin cloud of smoke. As expected, it's a wisp of a true divine's aura. Seeing this change, Luo Fan's eyes shone brightly. Immediately after, the light disappeared, and he sighed. It's a pity that it's just a copy of this great disaster. It's completely different. It doesn't have much of the profoundness of a true divine's aura. At this moment, his light of heaven and earth had already completely shattered the remaining great path and devoured it into the light of heaven and earth. It was no longer the great Tao that directly came into contact with that wisp of aura, but Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the entire world in the outside world had become extremely chaotic. It was as if the entire world had been completely shattered into countless fragments, and then reassembled at random. At a glance, it seemed as if countless fragments were gathering around the light of the world like smoke, revolving around the light of the world, and undergoing various transformations. At a glance, it seemed as if the entire world was left with only Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, and the wisp of aura that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. An illusory life, an illusory life. It's a pity that it's only now that it's a little bit real. A disappointed voice came from the aura. As the voice spoke, the wisp of aura gradually dissipated and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. The entire process was so fast that even Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth could not catch a single trace of it and could not leave a single trace of the aura, as expected of a true divine's aura, even if it's just a copy. Luo Fan could not help but sigh when he saw the change in the wisp of aura. His light of heaven and earth had already enveloped the aura like an inescapable net. Under such circumstances, the aura could actually still self-destruct through some kind of change that he could not understand. This had already exceeded his original estimation of the aura, and he could not help but sigh. The dissipation of the wisp of aura also meant that the last bit of resistance in this world had disappeared without a trace. This meant that this world had become a piece of cake waiting for him to devour. After confirming that the aura had really disappeared without a trace, Luo Fan did not hesitate any longer. He immediately directed his thoughts towards the light of heaven and earth that had changed its appearance and seemed to have a strange pillar supporting it. As this thought entered his mind, the light of heaven and earth turned and suddenly produced an endless suction force. It began to continuously pull the fragments of the world that had been shattered and reassembled in the outside world towards the light of heaven and earth. They continuously entered the light of heaven and earth and gradually fused with the light of heaven and earth, turning into a part of the light of heaven and earth. With this change, the pillar inside the light of heaven and earth also began to distort and gradually change into the appearance of roots. A situation similar to the previous world appeared at the border of this world. The endless great calamity evil Qi continued to press down on this world as it was devoured, filling up the space that the world had made way for, creating a phenomenon like the sudden appearance of a storm. Luo Fan had already expected this change. At this moment, his expression did not change at all. He only continued to control the light of heaven and earth to devour the fragments of the world outside. Even the world had been minced and devoured, so the existence of time naturally became meaningless. After an unknown period of time, which seemed to be 1,000,000,000 years or just a few breaths, this world was completely submerged in the light of heaven and earth. Along with this world, there was also a boundless great calamity, evil chi, that seemed to be able to completely crush any existence. Compared to before, Luo Fan, who had already expected this, had already strengthened the protection of the light of heaven and earth to a certain extent. In the face of the violent impact of the great calamity, evil chi, he only felt his body tremble violently, but his body did not suffer much damage, of course. Even so, he was stunned for a long time before he regained consciousness. His expression remained blank for a long time. The terrifying impact of the great calamity, evil chi, in the outside world was due to the instantaneous change caused by the sudden disappearance of the world. After a while, when the great calamity, evil chi, completely filled the gap caused by the disappearance of the world, the pressure naturally eased, and the pressure on the light of heaven and earth naturally weakened to the extent that the light of heaven and earth could withstand. At this moment, Luo Fan regained consciousness. He turned his head and saw the fragment that had devoured the world in the boundless great calamity, evil chi, as well as the light of heaven and earth that the fragment carried. Compared to when his consciousness had just fused with the octopus world, there didn't seem to be any changes to the fragment and the light between the heavens and earth. It was still as calm and indifferent as before. It floated in the boundless ominous aura, giving off a feeling that it was impervious to all tribulations. At this moment, the fragment opened its eyes, and a familiar gaze appeared in them. Immediately afterward, the two fragments shouted at the same time, "Merge!" Along with this shout, the two light of heaven and earth instantly merged and turned into one. The two Luo Fan also overlapped with each other and directly merged into one Luo Fan. Under this fusion, Luo Fan's cultivation realm improved once again. In a trance, he seemed to be one step closer to becoming a sixth tribulation powerhouse. In other words, he was one step closer to breaking through the shackles of the realm before him. The change in the light of heaven and earth was even more obvious. The roots of the two huge roots directly merged into one, making the light of heaven and earth look like two roots had grown from a source. Seeing this, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Although there were some twists and turns, it was still smooth in the end, he murmured. His gaze swept across the world, and the unknown number of trillions of worlds in the great calamity, evil chi, entered his eyes. At this moment, because he had merged with the two fragments, his essence had become much stronger. However, his will was still his entire will, and there was no difference compared to before. There were no melodramatic incidents like the main body and the main body clashing with each other. Chapter 2435. The boundless ominous aura clearly simulated the state of chaos. In such a place, time clearly did not exist. Of course, for Luo Fan, who possessed the will of a living being, time seemed to exist. As a result, what determined a living being's time was clearly their perception of time. As a result, for Luo Fan, how much time he spent in the great calamity's baleful aura completely depended on his own will and his own thoughts. Because there were simply too many worlds that he had to deal with, there were even trillions of them. As a result, when he dealt with those worlds, or rather, when he helped the fragments that existed in those worlds to transcend, he slowed down his own time to an extreme degree. As a result, every instant he experienced in the world where his will descended would be counted in billions of years. As a result, the heaven and earth light within the great calamity baleful aura would replace the heaven and earth light and fuse with it at every instant. At the same time, there would be a fragment that looked exactly like him fusing into his body at every moment. This change caused his cultivation realm to continuously climb. As he advanced towards the level of a sixth tribulation expert, the light of the world was also growing indescribably at every moment. The greatest manifestation of this growth was that the light of the world was becoming more and more resplendent, and the number of roots inside was also increasing. Just like this, over 1,000,000 years had passed in Luo Fan's senses. The countless worlds that were originally densely packed in the Great Tribulation baleful aura had unknowingly been reduced to only a few hundred worlds. These hundreds of worlds were scattered in the boundless Great Calamity baleful chi. They were like scattered stars scattered in the pitch-black starry sky. They seemed so distant and mysterious. The light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan's body had completely changed at this moment. It seemed like a real world, and it revolved around Luo Fan. There seemed to be endless light and shadows, countless mysteries, and countless phenomena that could only appear in a real world. Amidst this realistic light of heaven and earth, there were trillions of densely packed root. Like an incomparably complex network, they covered every corner of the light of heaven and earth and connected every inch of it. At the point where these roots were connected, which was also the origin, they had already merged into an existence that was billions of times more complicated than before. The billions of roots that were originally distinct had unknowingly mixed up the barriers between each other and truly merged into a huge main root. The formation of this main root also truly unified the countless trillions of heaven and earth, great Tao, and world will that had previously fused with the light of heaven and earth, causing them to truly become a part of the light of heaven and earth. They truly became the support for the light of heaven and earth, the resources for its growth. On this day, when Luo Fan fused a certain fragment back into his body, and also fused a certain fragment of the light of the world into the light of the world suddenly began to tremble violently. In this trembling, the will of the world within the light of the world began to produce an indescribable sublimation. The light of heaven and earth that was originally like a living thing gradually retracted that feeling of a living thing. A sense of vastness, and boundlessness slowly seeped out from the light of heaven and earth. The infinite existence that had originally seemed extremely chaotic within the light of the world seemed to have been combed by some great power. In the blink of an eye, it had already been reconstructed, turning into countless spacetimes and worlds, forming a complete system of worlds. Within this system, there was an extremely fundamental existence that connected all spacetimes, all heavens, and all worlds within the entire group of worlds. It was a worldview that completely belonged to Luo Fan. The trillions of roots that had originally existed within the light of the world became increasingly blurry. In the end, they completely disappeared without a trace in an instant, as if they had never been there in the first place. Metamorphosed? At this moment, a strange thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he felt that his understanding of the world, his understanding of cultivation, and his worldview had all made unimaginable leaps forward. In a trance, he seemed to have broken through some indescribable barrier and became completely different from before. If he were to face his previous self now, he was confident that he could easily crush his previous self to death with a single finger. Even if he had a close connection with the corresponding existences in the countless planes just a moment ago, and as long as he did not completely wipe out the existences in all the planes, he would not die, but he could not stop the current him from completely crushing a finger of his previous self. Moreover, it was a crushing that had no possibility of resurrection. "I've finally broken through." Sensing his changes, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already crossed the barrier between the fifth and sixth tribulations? He had truly become a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Carefully experiencing the process of his breakthrough, comprehending the various subtle changes that had taken place in his body during this process, Luo Fan seemed to have understood something in his heart, as if he had comprehended more things that could only be understood but could not be explained in words. This was the first time that he had such a clear understanding of the breakthrough he had obtained during the Great Tribulation. In the past, when he had undergone the Great Tribulations, He had relied on himself to endure the attacks of the great tribulations. In the end, he discovered that he had broken through after the great tribulation, and his strength was completely different from before. As for where exactly he had broken through and how exactly he had broken through, he was still unclear. Although it was not to the extent of being completely confused, it was difficult for him to easily describe it. Only this time, during the sixth Great Tribulation, did he truly grasp the entire process of breaking through. He grasped the entire process of his cultivation, rising bit by bit from the peak of the fifth tribulation to finally crossing the bottleneck and the sturdy barrier before him. Any first time was of great significance to a living being. Even Luo Fan was the same. This was the first time he had felt his cultivation breakthrough during the great tribulation of the world. To him, this feeling was extremely wonderful. It allowed him to vaguely understand the nature of the Great Tribulation a little more. Perhaps the Great Tribulation is a guide, a fortuitous encounter, not a punishment. Thinking of this, his expression became inexplicably deep. After breaking through, the surrounding Great Tribulation baleful chi was no longer as absolute to him as before. At this moment, he felt that his senses were no longer obstructed by the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi around him. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi. He instantly understood every inch of the Great Tribulation baleful chi, as well as the various mysterious and subtle structures within the Great Tribulation baleful chi with a thought. He made a grabbing motion with his hand, and a mysterious power spread out from his hand. It was directly used on the few hundred remaining worlds that were scattered in the great calamity baleful chi at that moment. Next, he exerted some force. The hundreds of worlds were like hundreds of specks of light in the void. They were grabbed by this power and quickly gathered in front of him. In the blink of an eye, they had already gathered into a disk in front of him, densely piling up there. Next, he smiled faintly and waved his hand. The hundreds of worlds shook and completely collapsed. They were completely devoured by the light of the universe that originally existed within them, turning into hundreds of specks of light that quickly gathered towards the light of the universe around Luo Fan. They directly fused with the light of the universe, adding hundreds of strange worlds to the cluster of worlds within the light of the universe. The incomparably huge and complicated roots flashed by, as if hundreds of roots had been added, before disappearing once again. At the same time, hundreds of fragments appeared from the remnants of the worlds and quickly rushed towards Luo Fan. They completely fused with Luo Fan's body in the blink of an eye. It added an indescribable sense of perfection to his already unparalleled strength. It was as if he had completely made up for the tiny flaws that he originally had. The entire process clearly showed that the worlds that were originally rather troublesome for him were no longer a problem. They could no longer restrain his fragments or his light of the universe. However, at this moment, Luo Fan's attention was not on the worlds that were no longer obstructing him. Instead, it was on the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi around him. "Break for me," he cried out as he looked at the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi around him. With this shout, the light around his body slightly trembled and suddenly shot out countless strands of light. Like strange arms, these strands of light grabbed the boundless Great Tribulation evil chi around him and tore it in all directions. With this tear, the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi began to surge violently. Endless power quickly rushed towards Luo Fan from all directions and fiercely pressed against the light of the heavens and earth. It wanted to crush the light of the heavens and earth. At the very least, it wanted to push back the countless palms that the light of the heavens and earth had created. However, in the eyes of Luo Fan, who could now see the structure of the Great Tribulation baleful chi with a single glance, there were too many flaws in this pressure. He did not even need to guide the light of the universe to take any action. Just the light of the universe responding on its own was enough to easily crush the terrifying pressure produced by the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi. The light of the universe was not affected at all as it continued to tear apart the Great Tribulation baleful chi. The foundation of the sixth tribulation began to tremble violently, showing signs of collapsing at any moment. In the face of this situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change as he let out a roar. With this roar, the boundless heaven and earth within the light of the universe, the world, and the space-time all exerted force at the same time. Under the guidance of the hidden will of the universe, an endless and terrifying power poured into the arms formed by the light of the universe and tore them apart in all directions. This caused the Great Tribulation baleful chi in front of Luo Fan to gradually reveal a strange nothingness, a nothingness that led to the outside of the Great Tribulation baleful chi. At this moment, the Great Tribulation baleful chi continued to surge. Figures appeared out of nowhere in the depths of the Great Tribulation baleful chi and looked at Luo Fan from afar. Luo Fan was extremely familiar with these figures. Shockingly, they were the existences related to true saints that he had seen when he had transcended or devoured the countless trillions of heavens and earths. They were either auras, shadows, living beings that resonated with true sages, gazes left behind by true sages, or items of true sages, compared to the heavens and earth. The existences in the Great Calamity baleful chi were much stronger. The boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi continued to flow into the bodies of these existences, constantly increasing their power and causing their auras to swell at every moment. When they first appeared, these existences were just as strong as they had been in the world. However, in just a short while, these existences had far surpassed their state in the world. They were not just 1 or 2 times stronger than they had been in the world, but thousands or even tens of thousands of times stronger. How could Luo Fan not feel anything when he was stared at by these gazes? At this moment, his gaze shifted from the Great Tribulation baleful chi that had been torn apart around him to the countless existences in the depths of the Great Tribulation baleful chi. Looking at these figures, Luo Fan had a look of realization on his face. As expected, it's impossible for me to get through this Great Tribulation baleful chi so easily. This thought flashed across his mind and he stopped tearing apart the Great Tribulation baleful chi. This kind of tearing might cause damage to the Great Tribulation baleful chi, but at the same time, if he wanted to continue tearing it apart, he would need to spend more effort and more strength. This kind of consumption was naturally not a big deal under normal circumstances. However, with so many existences related to true sages eyeing him covetously, this kind of consumption could lead to eternal damnation if he was not careful. At the same time, in many other worlds, the existences corresponding to Luo Fan were also surrounded by various dangerous existences. Those were obviously the existences corresponding to the existences related to true sages in many other worlds. Because these existences had become more powerful, their encirclement of the existences corresponding to Luo Fan was at least 10 times tighter than what Luo Fan had imagined. The pressure that was emitted during the encirclement was also much stronger than what he had imagined. From this point, it could be seen that it was already impossible for him to easily avoid the encirclement and escape from the different worlds. Chapter 2436. The aura released by the countless existences related to true sages continued to rise and sublimate, causing Luo Fan, who was extremely far away from them, to feel an increasingly terrifying pressure. In the face of the pressure released by the countless existences, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The light of heaven and earth shook slightly and carried his body towards those existences at high speed. He was not interested in waiting to be besieged by these existences. The boundless Great Calamity evil chi no longer had the same absolute characteristics as before to the current light of heaven and earth. At this moment, although the Great Calamity evil chi could still obstruct the light of heaven and earth, it only required the light of heaven and earth to expend some energy to break through the obstruction. In such a process, in just a flash, the light of heaven and earth, had already left behind a vacuum mark in the boundless great calamity ominous aura that almost completely separated the great calamity ominous aura. It directly went from its original position to the depths of the great calamity ominous aura, where many existences related to true sages were. In the face of Luo Fan and the light of heaven and earth, none of the existences related to true sages were interested in talking to Luo Fan. Almost all of them attacked him at the same time. Waves of aura that belonged to true sages were released from their bodies. Mysterious and wonderful attacks that had the effect of destroying heaven and earth pounced towards Luo Fan from all directions. Although the Great Calamity Evil Chi was still Great Calamity Evil Chi in essence, it simulated the state of chaos in this Great Calamity Evil Chi. Such a Great Calamity Evil Chi naturally had some characteristics of a state of chaos. At this moment, under the countless attacks that contained the aura of true sages, the Great Calamity Evil Chi was driven by the attacks and produced billions of changes that could not be described with words. Countless light shadows were formed and they directly drowned Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth, which was like a group of worlds around Luo Fan's body, wriggled slightly and there seemed to be countless roots appearing within it. Then, all kinds of strange waves were transmitted from the light of heaven and earth, and quickly surged in all directions. Along with this change, the surrounding Great Tribulation baleful aura, which had undergone all sorts of changes due to the attacks that contained the aura of a true saint, seemed to have been instantly suppressed. The changes that were originally happening almost instantly calmed down. It was as if the space-time dimension behind the Great Calamity Evil Chi had suddenly been pressed to pause. Originally, the coordination between the many existences related to true sages was extremely tacit and could even be said to be perfect. But at this moment, when the numerous attacks were stopped, the almost perfect coordination could no longer be called perfect. Countless small openings appeared out of nowhere among the numerous attacks, and could be said, after all, the perfect combination itself was a combination of time and space dimensions. Now, the light of the space-time and the space-time dimension were extremely dense. The attacks were, and the evil divine sages. To it, the seas, and the sages of sages, and evil divine Ordo evil, the great in the blink of an eye, the attacks were wrapped up by countless roots. Soon after, all of the attacks trembled slightly before completely collapsing. All of the light and shadows brought about by the attacks also disintegrated during this process and disappeared without a trace. In just a few breaths' time, the many attacks that were related to true sages had completely collapsed against Luo Fan. In the boundless Great Calamity Evil Chi, only Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth on the surface of his body, and the countless existences related to true sages were left. Since these existences related to true sages could be related to true sages, they were definitely not simple. Even though the current situation was extremely bad for them, and it seemed like they no longer had a chance to turn things around, they still couldn't do anything about it. However, not a single one of them was discouraged by this, and not a single one of them was willing to retreat because of this. At this moment, the creatures formed by the remnant aura of true sages were the first to take action. They each launched an attack against the light of heaven and earth. However, compared to the previous attacks, their attacks this time were more targeted. They were targeted at the light of heaven and earth. Although on a fundamental level, these attacks weren't much stronger than the previous ones, they were still much more powerful. However, because of this targeted existence, the threat of these attacks to the light of heaven and earth was many times stronger than before. For a moment, Luo Fan, who was inside the light of heaven and earth, felt an inexplicable pressure coming from all directions from the many new attacks that had just been born. Faintly, the entire Great Calamity Evil Chi seemed to have some kind of movement with the attacks at this moment. It was as if some kind of supreme power had gathered the entire Great Calamity Evil Chi. Then, the Great Calamity Evil Chi began to produce incomparably wonderful turbulence, producing various kinds of indescribable power. The attacks that were launched from all directions seemed to have increased the power of those attacks by 1,000 times. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan did not take any action. He would not make the same mistake that the remnant aura of true sages in the octopus world had made previously. Although he had made a breakthrough, the essence of his life had not reached the true sage's stage. As long as he had not reached the true sage's stage, it was impossible for him to have a willpower that could override the will of heaven and earth. Without this willpower, if he tried to control the will of heaven and earth, the strength that the will of heaven and earth could exert would be greatly hindered. This kind of hindrance was naturally not a big deal to other ordinary living beings, and it would still be enough to easily defeat those living beings. However, if he were to face an enemy that was at the same level as the will of heaven and earth, this kind of hindrance would be a fatal flaw. And now, although the enemies that Luo Fan was facing were not real true sages or supreme existences that were at the same level as the will of heaven and earth, they were still existences that were related to true sages. With the help of the great calamity Evil Chi, even if they could not be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient like true sages. However, who knew if they would obtain some kind of breakthrough at some point and burst out with a true sage-level attack? With such a worry, how could he not choose a more appropriate method to deal with the attacks of the many existences that were related to true sages? At this moment, other than the auras that were more closely related to true sages, many other existences that were related to true sages also reacted. One by one, they began to join the auras and began to gather their power to help the auras attack the light of heaven and earth, as well as attack Luo Fan, who was inside the light of heaven and earth. Facing such a situation, the light of heaven and earth automatically produced all kinds of extremely exquisite countermeasures. The many roots in the light of heaven and earth seemed to have suddenly turned into divine dragons, rushing out of the light of heaven and earth in an extremely mysterious manner. They stirred in the boundless great calamity Evil Chi, and every root brought with it billions of changes in an instant, directly cutting into the numerous attacks in an extremely exquisite manner. The attacks were also extremely extraordinary, and almost every attack was enough to send any perfect world back to the primordial world. The changes contained in every attack were also unimaginably rich. If any of the attacks were to be drawn out and placed in any world, it would probably be enough to cause countless cultivators to have an epiphany, and it was enough to allow countless living beings to comprehend some kind of cultivation truth. However, at this moment, the complexity of the attacks and the changes were completely crushed by the many roots that were released by the light of heaven and earth. The roots that were released by the light of heaven and earth were even more complex and changed faster, and the countless earth-shattering attacks were completely wiped out. The entire process was so straightforward that it was as if the attacks were not related to a true saint, but just ordinary castles that were piled up on the beach. Afterward, before Luo Fan could react, the roots had already taken a step further, directly penetrating countless obstacles, and directly piercing into the bodies of the many existences that were related to true saints. As the various subtle and inexplicable changes occurred, the countless existences that were related to true saints completely disintegrated, causing them to completely turn invisible in the blink of an eye. They disappeared without a trace in the boundless great calamity Evil Chi and the surroundings. In just a few breaths of time, only Luo Fan and his light of heaven and earth were left in the entire great calamity Evil Chi. "What other tricks do you have?" Looking at this scene, Luo Fan seemed to be deep in thought, and an inexplicable look of anticipation appeared on his face. Although the battle between the many existences that were related to true saints and the light of heaven and earth was extremely short, it had already made him feel countless mysteries that he had not felt before, and he had experienced the various incredible characteristics of the existences that were related to true saints. Under such circumstances, at this moment, he could not help but feel an indescribable anticipation for the various tricks that the great calamity Evil Chi would evolve into. He hoped that the great calamity evil Qi would bring him more surprises, and allow him to comprehend more profound mysteries of cultivation. Unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. While Luo Fan was waiting for the great calamity evil Qi to evolve into more attacks, the great calamity evil Qi stopped evolving. The boundless great calamity evil Qi seemed to have lost its source, and it began to become thinner and thinner. At this speed, it would not be long before the great calamity evil Qi completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. This situation was almost exactly the same as when he had hoped that the great calamity evil Qi would not evolve into too many attacks. Back then, when he had hoped that the great calamity evil Qi would not evolve into too many attacks, the great calamity evil Qi had also ignored his expectations and directly evolved into countless worlds, directly slicing him into countless pieces. I have already passed the sixth great calamity of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding. A mixture of regret and joy welled up in his heart. He was naturally happy that he had already passed the great calamity and was one step closer to becoming a true saint. However, it was a pity that he had the protection of the light of heaven and earth. He clearly had enough strength to ignore the danger brought by the great calamity evil Qi, and he was looking forward to the great calamity evil Qi lasting a little longer and evolving into more complicated changes. However, the great calamity evil Qi did not meet his expectations. The dissipation of the great calamity evil Qi did not change according to Luo Fan's will. Although it did not dissipate too quickly, it could not be stopped at all. Not long after, all the great calamity evil Qi disappeared without a trace, and his surroundings turned into a boundless void. In this void, there seemed to be an indescribable existence rapidly approaching from a mysterious place. Before he could take a clear look at his surroundings and figure out what was approaching him, an endless golden light filled the void after the great calamity evil Qi disappeared. The golden light was so mysterious, and there were so many of them. It contained endless sacredness and majesty. Being submerged in this golden light, even Luo Fan had an incomparably comfortable feeling. Subsequently, the golden light began to shrink towards the light of heaven and earth. In just a few breaths, the golden light that had originally covered the endless void had shrunk to a ball of golden light that could only envelop Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. And because of this shrinking, the brightness of the golden light had unknowingly increased by a few 100 million times. Although it wasn't enough to burn Luo Fan's eyes blind, it still made him lose his sense of the outside world. The only thing left in his senses was the golden light that seemed to be able to burn the eyes of all living beings. An indescribable sense of satisfaction came from the light of heaven and earth, and it affected Luo Fan's mind, making him feel dazed. Whether it was his sense of time or his sense of space, they all lost their meaning in this daze. After an unknown period of time, the golden light completely disappeared, and Luo Fan felt that he had arrived at a completely unfamiliar, brand new place. Before he paid attention to his surroundings, he noticed that his cultivation realm seemed to have taken a step forward, and he was no longer at the level of a sixth tribulation expert. As for his light of heaven and earth, it had completely turned into a disk of light that hung directly behind his head, squirming slowly. Every time it wriggled, the world group inside seemed to undergo some extremely subtle evolution, as if the era in the world group was changing, and every time it wriggled, there were all sorts of unbelievable mysteries contained within, as if it was evolving the infinite principles of the universe, and displaying the various mysteries of cultivation that Luo Fan had and had yet to grasp. Chapter 2437. For Luo Fan, the difficulty of the sixth Great Tribulation was much lower than he had imagined. This was not because the sixth tribulation was easy, but because he had already condensed the light of heaven and earth that he could not condense before the sixth tribulation. It was precisely because of the light of heaven and earth that he was able to maintain the integrity of his will when he was split into billions of pieces. he was still able to perfectly control the countless pieces and prevent them from becoming independent and developing their own consciousness. However, even so, his consciousness had experienced billions of worlds, witnessed the mysteries of billions of worlds, and accepted the endless challenges of billions of worlds. In the end, he finally achieved a breakthrough and successfully passed the tribulation. Even for him, he felt as if he had been in a different world at this moment. After a long time, Luo Fan finally paid attention to his surroundings. According to his last action before the tribulation, he should be on the 5th level of the Tao Master Path. In other words, he should have come here to obtain the light of heaven and earth. At a glance, he was in a strange universe that was completely weaved by light. In this universe, no matter what existence it was completely weaved by the strange light. Whether it was the countless stars in the universe or the empty void of the universe, they were all constructed in this way. With Luo Fan's eyesight, he could clearly see how many legs an ant had, even if it was billions of light years away. At this moment, he swept his eyes across and saw the countless stars in the universe clearly. At first glance, those stars looked like normal stars in the universe. Some were extremely barren and did not meet the requirements of living beings at all. However, some of them were extremely prosperous and full of vitality. Just like the void of the universe, everything that existed on those stars was also woven from light. It seems so strange and mysterious. Where are those cultivators? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. As he thought about it, he began to search for the cultivators who came from outside the Tao Master Path. This was the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. Naturally, there were also countless cultivators cultivating here. On the other hand, everything on the 5th level was naturally made up of light, so it couldn't be that the foreign cultivators were of the same nature, right? Just like what was mentioned before, Luo Fan's eyesight was amazing. As long as he wanted to find something, it would be impossible for it to escape his senses. Soon, he saw some people who seemed to be foreign cultivators. They are actually using this method to construct their bodies. Is this how they condense the light of heaven and earth? Luo Fan was secretly surprised. With a single thought, the light of heaven and earth behind him trembled slightly, and he instantly traversed several light years, arriving on a planet that was brimming with vitality. They arrived at the place where the creature that seemed to be an outsider cultivator was. At first glance, this creature looked just like any other ordinary creature in this universe. It was also formed from countless rays of light condensed in a strange form. However, as long as one looked carefully, they would find that it was only on the surface. In fact, those things that looked like rays of light hid the flesh, power, mind, and everything else that belonged to this creature in an extremely mysterious way. Newcomer. The creature's reaction was extremely sharp. It immediately discovered Luo Fan the moment he appeared. When it saw the unchanged flesh structure on Luo Fan's body, it could not help but smile. Looking at his reaction, Luo Fan could not help but be slightly stunned. Normally, this should not be the case. When a normal cultivator encountered the existence of another cultivator who suddenly appeared in front of them, they would definitely be vigilant and alert. If they were a little hot-tempered, they might even directly attack. How could they be as calm as this cultivator in front of them? It was as if Luo Fan's appearance was not surprising at all. However, since the cultivator in front of him was so calm, Luo Fan naturally did not bother to check his memory. At this moment, he just smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, how can you tell? Only a fellow Taoist who has just ascended will walk on this 5th level with this kind of flesh and blood body. Besides, you've brought up a world group from the 4th level. This is really too obvious, isn't it?" The cultivator looked at Luo Fan and could not help but laugh. This place was the top of a mountain that was neither too tall nor too short on this planet. Behind this cultivator was a rather ordinary-looking stone house, and this creature was currently sitting in front of the mountain and fishing in the sea of clouds ahead. Hearing this person's words, Luo Fan knew that this person thought that the light of heaven and earth above his head was the world group that was brought up from the fourth level. However, this was also normal. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth indeed showed the appearance of an extremely strange world group. At least on the surface, there was not much difference between it and the world group that was brought up from the fourth level. Moreover, at this moment, Luo Fan was completely in the form of flesh and blood. For the cultivator who was already used to the fifth level, this was almost directly saying that this was the world group. I see, I didn't expect this to be the thing that revealed my identity. I'm Luo Fan, what's your name, fellow Taoist? Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, the cultivator was slightly taken aback. He turned his head and said, Fellow Taoist, you don't know me? If you don't know me, why did you directly come to me? His tone was as absurd as saying that Luo Fan did not know that the sun was round. Luo Fan could not help but be surprised and asked, Fellow Taoist clearly knows that I've just ascended, why do you think I know you? Hearing this, the cultivator could not help but laugh. Then, he withdrew his power that was fishing in the sea of clouds and turned to face Luo Fan. It seems that I'm the first cultivator that you've encountered since ascending. In that case, fellow Taoist's luck is truly very good. The first person you came to was me. If you found someone else, I'm afraid it wouldn't be so pleasant. While speaking, the cultivator introduced himself to Luo Fan. Then, he talked about why he was the first to find him was a lucky thing. It was because this cultivator was called Perfected Zhongde. Although he was the disciple of a Tao master, he was very friendly to itinerant cultivators and was a good teacher. For anyone who came to ask for advice, no matter their identity, even if they were mortals, he would answer almost all of their requests. No matter what they asked, as long as he knew it, he would tell them everything. Because of this, no matter where he lived in seclusion, there would always be a large number of cultivators coming to him to ask for advice on things they didn't know. Some even asked for advice on cultivation. This was the reason why he was so calm when he first saw Luo Fan. It was because he had seen Luo Fan's dangerous way too many times. It could even be said that it would appear once every few days, so how could he not be familiar with it? As for what would have happened if Luo Fan went to find other cultivators, Perfected Zhongde also roughly explained. The most likely development was that the cultivator would directly attack Luo Fan and completely destroy Luo Fan, who had just arrived at the fifth floor and had not yet fully adapted to the rules of the fifth floor. After all, cultivators who lived on the stars had the nature of cultivating in seclusion. If they suddenly appeared in front of him, even if it was not considered as destroying his cultivation, it would definitely be considered as a provocation. How could they not erupt? After all, not everyone was a virtuous immortal. Understanding this, Luo Fan naturally didn't seem to care. Of course, it was not that Perfected Zhongde's calculation was wrong, and things would not develop as he predicted. It was because he didn't think that these cultivators could do anything to him. In other words, if they made a move, the one who would suffer would not be him. Just like at this time, if Perfected Zhongde didn't choose to have a good talk with Luo Fan and instead chose to make a move, his memory would definitely be completely exposed to Luo Fan now. However, since Perfected Zhongde was so friendly to him, he naturally couldn't directly say arrogant words like he could suppress all hostility. At the moment, he just apologized and said that he was really lucky to be able to meet Perfected Zhongde. This star was quite strange. There were countless cloud beasts hidden in the sea of clouds. They lived in the sea of clouds like ordinary fish living in the sea. The reason why Perfected Zhongde chose this star to live was because he was interested in this kind of cloud beast. He chose this mountain that didn't seem to have anything special because there were a lot of cloud beasts in this location. Of course, when he fished in this sea of clouds before, he didn't really need this kind of fishing for any research or cultivation, but just to pass the time. Now that Luo Fan was here, He had already put aside the matter of fishing and directly pulled Luo Fan to his stone house. This stone house was a world that he had opened up. It had a round sky and a flat earth, with various terrains and landscape. Moreover, more importantly, the composition of this world was completely different from the composition of the universe outside. It was not weaved by light, but a real structure like the ordinary world that Luo Fan had seen before. Once he arrived, Reverend Zhong De let out a long breath. He shuddered, and the countless threads of light that formed his body shuddered slightly at that instant. The flesh, blood, power, and everything else hidden in the countless threads of light were released to replace his body, allowing him to regain the appearance of a body of flesh and blood. Finally, I can relax. Although maintaining the state of light can help me better understand the essence of light and is good for condensing the light of heaven and earth, after all, it conflicts with the essence. It's really too uncomfortable. Perfected Zhongde stretched his body, and a relaxed expression appeared on his face. When Luo Fan came here, he also felt that his body was slightly lighter, as if some kind of shackles had been removed, and his body and mind became inexplicably comfortable. Feeling this change, for a moment, Luo Fan thought of many things, and he had a better understanding of the nature of the countless light threads in the universe outside. Faintly, he had some understanding of why these cultivators had to transform themselves in that way. Perhaps it was not only to use that form to understand the mystery of the light of heaven and earth, and eventually condense the light of heaven and earth. More importantly, it was because if they did not exist in that way, they were afraid that they would be hurt by the fifth level of the road to Tao Master. Of course, this was only for ordinary cultivators. For Luo Fan, who had sublimated the light of heaven and earth to the level of countless roots, that kind of possible harm was obviously nothing to him. Almost all the harm had been absorbed by the light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that he was so slow to react. He only discovered the existence of this injury when he entered this area that was completely isolated from the light of the fifth layer. How is it? Do you feel it? Do you feel that the consumption of the origin has disappeared? At this time, Perfected Zhongde said to Luo Fan with a smile. At this time. Hearing this, Luo Fan already understood the impact of the light of the fifth level on cultivators. Now that he understood what this effect was, he also understood what that light was. It has indeed disappeared. Thank you, Taoist friend. Luo Fan said with a smile. Perfected Zhongde laughed and did not take Luo Fan's thanks seriously at all. He just took Luo Fan to the place in this world where he lived, and told Luo Fan many of the taboos that he knew to cultivate in the fifth level. He also gave Luo Fan the star map of the fifth level, marking a large number of suitable places for cultivators to cultivate. This kind of attitude was almost like he regarded Luo Fan as a good friend who had gone through life and death. Even ordinary people might not be as meticulous to their good friends who had gone through life and death. His attitude made Luo Fan suddenly understand why Taoist Master Zhongde did not need to guard against him at all, and was unexpectedly so magnanimous towards his appearance. If he faced anyone else with this kind of attitude, then obviously, he would not have any enemies. And without enemies, he naturally did not need to be vigilant against anyone, and could face anyone openly. Not to mention others, didn't Luo Fan, who originally planned to directly search his memory, because of his attitude, didn't he give up his original plan and change to using words to communicate with him? This kind of communication took a few days. In these days, Luo Fan also felt how wide the circle of friends of Perfected Zhongde was. In just a few days, there were nearly 20 cultivators who came to find him. They asked him something, told him something, demanded something, or sent something. It really made Luo Fan feel that it was an eye-opener. Chapter 2438. A few days later, Taoist Master Zhongde finally told Luo Fan everything that a cultivator who had just stepped into the fifth level needed to know. This allowed Luo Fan to finally have a complete concept of the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Thank you, Taoist friend. Before leaving, Luo Fan said to Taoist Master Zhongde. It's just a small effort. I only hope it can help Taoist friend. Taoist Master Zhongde said with a smile. From his expression, he didn't feel that he had done anything for Luo Fan. As for whether the actions of other cultivators were sincere or not, Luo Fan could naturally see at a glance. He had clearly seen Taoist Master Zhongde's performance over the past few days. Every word and every action was from the bottom of his heart. What he did was what he thought in his heart. In other words, his kindness towards other cultivators wasn't some kind of hypocrisy or some kind of scheme. Instead, his heart was truly filled with kindness. If it was hypocrisy or some kind of scheme, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be moved. However, all the kindness of the other party came from the bottom of his heart and came from his own heart. Luo Fan couldn't help but be moved. At this moment, he smiled slightly and said, Taoist friend's little effort will be of great benefit to me. How about this, since Taoist friend has helped me so much, I can't not return the favor. As he spoke, he pointed at Taoist Master Zhongde's forehead. This finger wasn't fast and seemed to be moving slowly. However, Taoist Master Zhongde found that no matter how he dodged, he couldn't escape this finger. Of course, with Taoist Master Zhongde's temperament, he didn't think that Luo Fan would harm him. At this time, he didn't have too strong of a desire to avoid it. He just said, Taoist friend is really too polite. Before he finished speaking, Luo Fan's finger had already touched his forehead. In an instant, a little light was transmitted from the finger into Taoist Master Zhongde's body. In an instant, Taoist Master Zhongde was stunned. His body froze, and his eyes were empty and vacant. There seemed to be countless turbulent waves of information surging in the depths of his eyes. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly and no longer paid attention to him. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure flashed and disappeared from the cave mansion, leaving the planet where Taoist Master Zhongde lived. Half a day after Luo Fan left, Taoist Zhongde gradually came back to his senses. His expression became shocked, as if he had suddenly discovered that an ant was actually a supreme god that could destroy the heavens and earth. There was disbelief in the depths of his eyes. How is this possible? How could he possibly know the bottleneck of my light of heaven and earth? He murmured, wondering if he was dreaming. Before Luo Fan left, the information that was poured into Taoist Master Zhongde's mind was none other than how to break through a certain bottleneck that Taoist Master Zhongde had encountered in his cultivation. It was about the bottleneck of the construction of the light of heaven and earth. Although he had only skimmed through the contents of the book for the past half a day, he had gained a lot just by skimming through it. He felt that this method was extremely feasible. If he followed this method to cultivate, it was very likely that he would break through this bottleneck and make great progress in the construction of the light of heaven and earth. Luo Fan. Luo Fan. I seem to have heard of this name. Suddenly, Taoist Master Zhongde thought of something and a strange expression appeared on his face. After all, he was already an expert who could stand on the 5th level of the Tao Master's road. Moreover, he was a disciple of a Tao Master. Needless to say, his memory was strong. As he thought back, he quickly found the source of this familiarity. His expression suddenly became even more strange. It seems that some of my fellow disciples were looking for an ascender who ascended from the 4th level. It seems that they wanted to find trouble with him. Could it be that fellow Taoist Luo Fan is the cultivator that they were looking for? Taoist Master Zhongde murmured, and was at a loss for a moment. Then, he shook his head and sighed. Forget it, these things have nothing to do with me. I'd better cultivate honestly. After saying this, his expression became calm again. At this time, a breath came from outside, but it was a breath that Taoist Master Zhongde was quite familiar with. It was one of the fellow disciples that he had just thought of. Feeling this breath, Taoist Master Zongda frowned slightly and showed a rare look of displeasure. However, his temperament was still there. After letting out a sigh, his figure flickered and turned back into the form of the countless lines of light. He exited his cave dwelling and came to the front of the stone house. At this time, a figure descended from the sky and directly stood in the air not far away from him. This was a figure that was also made of countless lines of light. He looked like a middle-aged man, but the aura that lingered around him was completely different from Taoist Master Zhongda's calm aura. Instead, it was a kind of high and mighty pride, a kind of majesty that controlled everything. It was as if everything in the world was under his control. The middle-aged man looked at Taoist Master Zhongda and frowned. "Senior brother Zhongda, what do you think about that matter? It has already been decades. Don't tell me that you wish to continue dragging this out?" The middle-aged man looked at Reverend Zhongda, frowned and said. Taoist Master Zhongda sighed and said, "Junior brother Lu Yu, I have already said it very clearly. You can handle this matter by yourselves. I prefer to honestly train by myself." Reverend Zhongda sighed and said. Taoist Master Zhongda sighed and said, "Cultivate honestly? How many years have you been in the 5th level? You still haven't formed the world's light and can't even stabilize its embryonic form. If you continue to cultivate like this, how many trillion years do you want to spend cultivating?" Junior brother Lu Yu was very unhappy. "This is my Tao. Junior brother doesn't need to say any more," Taoist Master Zhongda said with a firm expression. Hearing this, junior brother Lu Yu was even more unhappy. However, although he looked extremely arrogant and was very impolite to Taoist Master Zhongda, he clearly did not regard Taoist Master Zhongda as an enemy, nor did he plan to attack him. Seeing that Taoist Master Zhongda was so resolute, he could only snort and say, "This is the last chance. If you don't seize it, don't regret it in the future." Taoist Master Zhongda shook his head and said, "I have already made up my mind. Junior brother Lu Yu doesn't need to say any more." Junior brother Lu Yu was unhappy again. He snorted and said, "Then it's up to you. This matter will start in 3 years. If you change your mind before then, you can find me at any time." Even at this step, he still left a way out for Taoist Master Zhongda. From this, it could be seen what kind of image Taoist Master Zhongda had in the hearts of others. After junior brother Lu Yu finished speaking, he waved his hand and his figure soared into the sky. He rushed thousands of feet above the void and disappeared without a trace in a flash. Seeing that junior brother Lu Yu disappeared, Taoist Master Zhongda sighed. "Sorry, he just helped me, but I can't betray him." As he spoke, there was a look of guilt on his face. It was because he knew the reason why junior brother Lu Yu came and left in a hurry. In fact, junior martial brother Lu Ju had been tasked by 5th senior martial brother to investigate the existence of a cultivator named Luo Fan who might have ascended from the 4th layer during this period of time. Before this, he would never have realized this. After all, he didn't care about this kind of thing, nor did he want to participate in this kind of thing at all. Although he had heard the name Luo Fan many times, every time it went in one ear and out the other, he didn't remember it at all. However, just now when he received the benefits from Luo Fan, he felt that Luo Fan's name was familiar. Therefore, he dug out the contents of Luo Fan's name from the depths of his memory, making this name that originally didn't have much sense become extremely profound at this time. That was why he was able to clearly understand junior brother Lu Yu's task and the trouble it would bring him. With his temperament, concealing the existence of Luo Fan and not helping junior brother Lu Yu to complete his mission was obviously not a small amount of pressure. However, Taoist Master Zhongda was not pedantic after all. Revealing Luo Fan might bring great trouble to Luo Fan, but not saying it would only make junior brother Lu Yu unable to make a contribution. How to choose was not a problem at all. Therefore, at this time, he didn't want to summon junior brother Lu Yu back to tell him what he had hidden. At this time, he just sighed with emotion, turned around and returned to his cave residence, and began to break through the bottleneck according to the method taught by Luo Fan just now. When entering the state of cultivation, he directly hung the sign of closed-door cultivation breakthrough in front of his cave residence, in order to avoid other cultivators who came to find him from disturbing his cultivation because of something. It also prevented them from being anxious because they couldn't find him. It was extremely difficult to condense the light of heaven and earth, whether it was for Luo Fan or for other cultivators on the 5th level, whether they were disciples of Tao Master or rogue cultivators. In contrast, although the disciples of Tao Master had some advantages in this aspect, it was just some advantages. After all, it was impossible to change the essence, and it was impossible to make the incomparably difficult things so simple. Even if Taoist Master Zongda wholeheartedly cultivated in the 5th level for so many billions of years, he was still stuck at the step where the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth was about to take shape. For Taoist Master Zongda, so many years of accumulation was obviously more than enough. What he lacked now was just the last bit of opportunity. And what Luo Fan taught him was the way to find this opportunity. After returning to the depths of the cave residence, Taoist Master Zongda restored his flesh and blood body. In his cultivation place, he sat cross-legged with his eyes closed. Spots of light began to float out from the depths of his body, and began to slowly condense above his head, to condense into a ball, and to integrate into a whole before getting the guidance of Luo Fan. He could only rearrange those light spots in a specific way according to his own understanding of the composition of the light of heaven and earth, and strive to form a complete whole. However, at this time, after getting the guidance of Luo Fan and understanding the key, he completely changed his original approach. He began to let these light spots converge into a strange vortex and began to slowly rotate around his body. During this process, every single one of those specks of light underwent an inexplicable change. They did not fuse with the other specks of light, but instead split up on their own, turning into faintly discernible strange space-time, or worlds, or even heaven and earth. Each of these light spots was condensed by Taoist Master Zongda over countless years. They were the essence of the light of heaven and earth. The truth contained in each point was indescribably rich, enough to shock any cultivator after seeing it. It was naturally not difficult for such light spots to evolve into space-time, to evolve into a world, and to evolve into a heaven and earth. It could even be said that this was just following the original trend of these light spots. As long as Taoist Master Zongda gave these light spots a starting power to evolve, these light spots would automatically evolve according to this trend, and eventually complete the evolution of space-time, world, and heaven and earth, allowing these light spots to transform at an extremely fast speed, and also allowing Taoist Master Zongda to become more and more relaxed. In the end, he did not even need to guide the specks of light at all. The specks of light would constantly evolve on their own, and along the vortex, began to spin in an extremely mysterious manner, gradually turning into an incomparably wondrous cluster of worlds. To a certain extent, it was similar to the group of worlds that he had derived from the creation power on the 4th level. After the group of worlds was formed, Taoist Master Zongda had a thought, and he began to change the way the vortex operated, causing the countless space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth to collide in the process. As they collided, the space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth either destroyed each other, fused with each other, crossed each other, or flew in different directions without being affected at all, displaying all sorts of unbelievable effects. As the changes progressed, the vortex gradually became chaotic, and the number of space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth within it began to decrease. The entire process was like pushing over a domino. Once it began, there was no way to stop it. One could only watch as the group of worlds headed towards an unpredictable future. During the process of the strange changes in the group of worlds, Taoist master Zongda felt that there was endless information and principles constantly gushing out from the bottom of his heart. The information was so complicated that even he could only comprehend a little bit of it. However, just these bits and pieces that he was able to comprehend had already allowed his cultivation to improve greatly. He felt as if he was climbing towards a higher level at every single moment, or perhaps it should be said that he was subliming. His perception of time and space had completely disappeared without him realizing it. Gradually, he forgot where he was and how much time he had spent cultivating in seclusion until now. Perhaps he had already left the Tao Master path, left the Tao Master Great World, and even left the state of chaos. Or perhaps he had always been in the same place. The time that he had experienced might have been hundreds of millions of years, or perhaps it was just a moment. Chapter 2439. An indescribably wonderful feeling lingered in Zhongda Immortal's heart. It made him feel as if he had been reborn, as if nothing could stop him, and all the mysteries of the universe seemed to be in his heart. He was immersed in this wonderful feeling for a while before he gradually came back to his senses. The moment he came back to his senses, he understood what had happened. He had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. He looked at the countless specks of light around him that had evolved into a cluster of worlds. As expected, the cluster of worlds had condensed into a single mass. Due to the collision and fusion between the heavens and the earth, worlds, and spacetime, the entire cluster of worlds appeared to be a single sphere of light that had fused into a single entity. An inexplicable aura, like that of a living creature, emanated from this round and integrated light. This was an aura emitted by the embryonic form of the will of heaven and earth. With this aura and all kinds of feelings in his heart, how could he not understand that this was the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth? I finally broke through. Zhongda Immortal murmured with an indescribable joy on his face. He had been cultivating on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path for billions of years. During such a long time, he had been suffering and working hard to condense the light of heaven and earth and break the biggest obstacle to ascending to the 6th level. However, all this time, perhaps because of his lack of comprehension, or perhaps because of the problem with his way of cultivation, he had been unable to succeed after waiting for so long. He did not expect that this time, because of a very ordinary act of kindness, he would break through the bottleneck. Although he did not directly condense the light of heaven and earth, he had already successfully condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. From now on, what he needed to do was to constantly perfect this embryonic form and cultivate it. Compared to the bitter suffering in front of the bottleneck before, the current task was still extremely complicated, but at least he could see a crooked path. As long as he had enough patience, enough time, and was willing to spend energy, he would eventually be able to make progress little by little. It could be said that such a small change was enough to free Zhongda Immortal from the state of being buried in the boundless bottom of the sea to a relaxed state of freedom. After experiencing the changes in his body and mind, he did not waste any more time in his cave abode. He directly left the cave abode and came to the side of the sea of clouds where he was fishing. At a glance, this star had already undergone a significant change. At first glance, the boundless sea of clouds didn't seem much different from before, but if one were to look carefully, one would notice that the cloud beasts in the sea of clouds had changed countless times. Even though he could still see many traces of the cloud beasts from the past, there was a huge difference in many of their appearances. Unless a powerful cultivator modified them, it would take at least 1,000,000 years for these cloud beasts to change due to the environment of this star. Zhenren Zhongda's heart was slightly moved. With a little deduction, he knew how long he had been in seclusion. From the moment he stepped into the abode until now, 8,000,000 years had already passed. It's been 8,000,000 years. I wonder how many fellow cultivators have come to find me but never met me. Zhenren Zhongda sighed. 8 million years was actually not too long for him, who had cultivated on the 5th floor for countless trillions of years. However, ever since he had made friends, he had never been in seclusion for so long. The longest time he had cultivated was only a little over 100,000 years. 8 million years had passed in a single cultivation session. Let alone him, even the cultivators that he usually interacted with were definitely not used to it. Looking at his surroundings, Zhenren Zhongda's body flowed with light that seemed to be alive. With a sweep of the light, a wave of aura instantly appeared in the air. This was none other than the aura left behind by all the living beings that had come to this place over the past 8 million years. This method of pulling out the aura of the past from the river of time was only an extremely basic use of the worldly light. There were many auras, and they were densely piled up here. There were probably over 100,000 of them. Some of them were strong, while others were weak. The strongest among them had already perfected the worldly light to a certain degree, and even had the qualifications to ascend to the 6th floor. As for the weaker ones, they hadn't even grasped the trick to condensing the worldly light. After a brief analysis, Zhenren Zhongda knew the frequency of these auras. The closer he was to the front, the more concentrated the auras became. The closer he was to the present, the more sparse the auras became. When the last aura arrived, it was already tens of thousands of years ago. In other words, during these tens of thousands of years, not a single aura had arrived. In other words, not a single cultivator who was on good terms with Zhenren Zhongda had come to check on him. Looking at these auras, Zhenren Zhongda couldn't help but smile bitterly. I didn't expect so many fellow cultivators to have come. Looks like I'll have to pay them a visit one by one. As he smiled bitterly, the embryonic form of the worldly light he released swept out again and completely erased the auras. Then, he directly left a message in front of the cave abode, saying that he was going to visit a friend. Afterward, he soared into the sky and directly left the planet, flying towards the place where the fellow cultivator closest to him was. He had already formed the embryonic form of the worldly light and needed to properly use it to understand its mysteries. Staying on that planet was not a suitable choice. Since he had to leave to visit a fellow cultivator, he naturally used this time to properly familiarize himself with his embryonic form of the worldly light. After forming the embryonic form of the worldly light, his strength had already made great progress. The distance of several hundred light years was not a problem for him at all. In just a few short breaths, he directly crossed this distance by flying and arrived in front of another planet. Compared to the planet that he had been living in seclusion on, the planet before him was completely different. The planet that he had been living in seclusion was a very normal planet with life. There were all sorts of creatures born on the surface of the planet, and they even built a rather prosperous civilization. There were even some cultivators there, however. The star in front of him was completely different. This star was a barren planet without any signs of life. The surface of the entire planet was covered in a layer of bizarre flames. Everything on the planet was enveloped by the flames. Under the flames, only soil and rocks could remain. Plants and other living things couldn't leave even the slightest trace on the planet. If it were not for the fact that the interior of the planet was composed of soil and rocks, it might have been more appropriate to call it a star. Taoist Zhongda has finally come out of seclusion? At this time, a voice was transmitted to Taoist Zhongda's ears. It was a clear male voice. Hearing this voice, Taoist Zhongda naturally revealed a faint smile. Yes, I finally made a small breakthrough this time, Taoist Zhongda said with a chuckle. His gaze converged on a certain place on the surface of the planet. There was a flame vortex there. At the center of the vortex there seemed to be a subtle distortion of space and time. It was as if there was an extremely complex structure hidden in the vortex. And that voice came from the center of the vortex. At this time, a figure appeared above the vortex, looking at Taoist Zhongda from afar. It was a middle-aged man, a rather handsome middle-aged man with red hair. His entire body seemed to emit heat, and he was completely weaved by light. This was Taoist Zhongda's good friend, a rogue cultivator named Reverend Flame. After seeing Taoist Zhongda, this Reverend Flame suddenly froze, then couldn't help but laugh. I didn't expect that after not seeing you for only a few million years, Taoist Zhongda has already made a breakthrough. This is truly worthy of celebration. Taoist Zhongda descended with a smile and arrived at the center of the vortex. The flames on the surface of the planet were not ordinary flames, but a mysterious flame that could burn one's soul. If an ordinary cultivator came here, even a glance at these flames would damage their soul. However, for an existence like Taoist Zhongda, who had condensed the embryonic form of the world's light, this kind of flame was not an obstacle at all. Even if he directly opened his soul and let it burn, he would not be affected. At this moment, he completely ignored the effect of the flame and directly came to the vortex. This Reverend Flame and Taoist Zhongda had been friends for hundreds of millions of years, so there was no need to be too polite at this time. He brought Taoist Zhongda to the new secret realm that he had recently opened up and showed him the various special environments that he had built to cultivate the embryonic form of the world's light. In the last few million years, has there been any special changes in the fifth level? After a tour, Taoist Zhongda asked. Normally, only a few million years was not a long time for the fifth level of the road to Tao Master. He even suspected that the entire fifth level might not have changed in the past few million years. However, the situation was completely different this time. Because, back then, Luo Fan, who was searched by many Tao Masters, had already entered the fifth level. Moreover, the plan of his fellow disciples had also begun to be implemented at that time. Under the interaction of these two aspects, there must be some special changes in the fifth level in the past few million years. Hearing this, Taoist Zunhua smiled and said, "The changes are not small. The cultivator called Luo Fan, who was searched by many Tao Masters, has appeared. Moreover, he has occupied a forbidden area for himself. Now, he has become an expert of the fifth level. Even though the Tao Masters know of his existence, they do not dare to attack him. Even if they want to enter the forbidden area to cultivate, they need to obtain Luo Fan's permission before they dare to." Taoist Zhongda's expression involuntarily became a little strange. He opened his mouth to speak, but could not say anything. Taoist Zunhua was slightly stunned when he saw Taoist Zhongda's appearance. He and Taoist Zhongda had known each other for hundreds of millions of years and were already extremely familiar with each other. At this moment, when he saw Taoist Zhongda's appearance, he guessed that Luo Fan was probably related to him. After thinking for a moment and combining it with Taoist Zhongda's character, he could not help but be surprised. "Don't tell me that you gave Luo Fan pointers back then?" Taoist Zhongda's expression stiffened. I did communicate with him back then," Taoist Zunhua sighed. "I knew it would be like this. Come to think of it, that forbidden area seems to be the closest forbidden area to the planet where you cultivate. It seems that he immediately rushed to that forbidden area after learning about its existence from you." Taoist Zhongda could not help but smile. "I also did not know that he would make such a choice, but I did not expect him to be so strong. Indeed, a cultivator who has just ascended for millions of years has actually become the master of a forbidden area. Who would believe this?" Taoist Zunhua sighed. His eyes were filled with envy, admiration, and even fear. He had not seen Luo Fan, but from the rumors, he knew how strong he was. It could be said that with his current strength, he could not even withstand a finger from Yi Shiwen. If such an existence had cultivated in the fifth level for hundreds of millions of years, he could still understand it. He also felt that it was reasonable to say that such an existence had returned from the sixth level. However, if it was said that he had ascended from the fourth level, he felt that his views had been subverted. "I think he should have condensed the worldly light to perfection on the fourth level. If he is willing now, perhaps he can already ascend. Taoist Zhongde sighed. His eyes were filled with longing and gratitude. Taoist Zunhua looked at Taoist Zhongde and suddenly had a flash of inspiration. Don't tell me your breakthrough this time was because of him? Taoist Zhongde nodded. It's not a secret that cannot be revealed. It was because he gave me pointers before he left that I was able to grasp the key and break through the bottleneck. I see. It seems that he is not as unreasonable as the rumors say. Taoist Zunhua let out a long sigh, as if he had completely let go of a certain knot in his heart. Taoist Zhongde was stunned. Taoist Luo Fan is a very easy person to talk to. Back then, I had a good chat with him. Why did you say that he is unreasonable? You better say this in front of me. If you say such words in front of your fellow disciples, I'm afraid they will immediately fall out with you. Taoist Zhongde said helplessly. Chapter 2440. Taoist Zunhua sighed and told Zhongde Immortal all the legends about Luo Fan that he had heard in the past 8 million years. As he spoke, Zhongde Immortal felt that his worldview had been subverted. Was the legendary cultivator really the same as the one he had met? Could it be that they had the same name? However, even though he was in disbelief, he did not think that Taoist Zunhua was lying to him. Therefore, he could only sigh and say, I didn't expect things to develop in such a way. It seems that my understanding of Taoist Luo Fan is still too little. Taoist Zunhua suddenly smiled and said, Why so serious? Anyway, for us, the distance between us has become extremely far. It is almost impossible for us to have any interaction in the future. As long as we don't provoke him, what does it have to do with us? Zhongde Immortal listened, smiled slightly, nodded and said no more. Although he was quite kind, he would never take everything on himself. Although he had a conversation with Luo Fan, it was just a conversation. He did not feel that he was responsible for Luo Fan. Nor did he think that Luo Fan was responsible for him. In this way, he had only heard about Luo Fan's current situation, but he had no intention of doing anything about it. While Zhongde Immortal was paying a return visit to many of his friends who had visited him in the past 8 million years, in a void that was nearly 100 billion light-years away from the place where Zhongde Immortal lived in seclusion, a strange fluctuation was released from somewhere in the void and began to spread throughout the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's path. This location, nearly 100 billion light-years away from the planet where Zhongde Immortal lived in seclusion, was actually one of the many forbidden areas for practitioners on the 5th level. Here, the void was extremely distorted, and the endless brilliance had become so intense that it directly created an unimaginable darkness, a darkness that was different from almost all other places on the entire 5th level. At first glance, the 5th level of the road to Tao Master looked like an endless universe. However, so long as one observed carefully, one would notice that everything in this universe, including the boundless pitch-black void, was constructed from boundless strange light. In other words, as long as one's eyesight was sharp enough, they would discover that the entire universe was actually emitting light at all times. There was no need to elaborate on how profound these lights were. Just their appearance and applicability alone was enough to show how extraordinary they were. At this moment, the structure of the countless rays of light in the void had been completely disrupted, causing the light here to be many times more intense than anywhere else. In the end, it created an incomparably deep and bizarre region that looked like the void of the universe. Compared to the stability of the other areas, the light in this area was clearly extremely chaotic. Normal cultivators, even those who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, would definitely not be able to stay in this area for long. Cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth did not even have the right to enter this area. It was precisely because of this that this area was designated as a forbidden area by the cultivators on the 5th level. Usually, unless there was a special reason, very few cultivators would enter this forbidden area. Even if they could enter, they would do so as quickly as possible, and they would try their best to stay in this area as little as possible. However, this was only the situation 8 million years ago. During these 8 million years, the situation in this forbidden area had been completely overturned by someone. It had gained an additional ruler. This ruler had appeared for the first time 8 million years ago. The moment he appeared, the light of heaven and earth that was as bright as water was released from his body, directly covering the entire forbidden area. In an instant, it seeped into the depths of the forbidden area and left his mark on every inch of the forbidden area. Afterwards, he instantly drove away all the cultivators who had to come to the forbidden area to search for something or borrow the dangerous environment to cultivate. He directly announced to the entire 5th level that this was his territory. Whether it was the disciples of the Tao Masters or the independent cultivators on the 5th level, none of them could stand this kind of behavior that directly took over the public area as their own. Thus, during the 1 million years after the ruler occupied this area, countless cultivators came to talk to him. They wanted him to leave the forbidden area and return it to all the cultivators on the 5th level. However, it was a pity that the ruler did not care about these cultivators' requests. If the cultivators who tried to talk to him did not make a move, he would completely ignore them and pretend he did not hear them. However, once a cultivator tried to use forceful methods to drive the ruler away, the ruler would immediately retaliate. All sorts of methods that even the disciples of the Tao Masters could not imagine were displayed in his attack. He easily crippled or drove away those cultivators. There were even a few times when he directly killed them. Just like that, the light continued for more than 1 million years. After more than 1 million years, the strongest disciple of the Tao Masters on the 5th level, the 5th senior brother, finally noticed this place and personally came to talk to the ruler. Whether it was the disciples of the Tao Masters or the independent cultivators, they all had great expectations for the 5th senior brother to make a move. In fact, some of the disciples of the Tao Masters who were familiar with the 5th senior brother even started to celebrate the reopening of the forbidden area. However, the final result shocked everyone. The 5th senior brother was in an extremely sorry state when faced with the ruler's methods. In the end, although he was able to use his various mysterious abilities to escape, he was still in an extremely sorry state. He was truly like a stray dog that had lost its home. As a result, the prestige of the ruler was immediately established. In the end, everyone had no choice but to admit that he was the ruler of the forbidden area. Of course, although the 5th senior brother retreated in a sorry state, his methods were still shocking, and his strength was unparalleled. Even if he could not compare to the ruler, he was still much stronger than countless other cultivators. As a result, through the battle with the ruler, he learned many things that the other cultivators did not. He learned that the ruler's name was Luofan, and that he was a cultivator that had recently ascended. He also learned that he was the cultivator that many of the disciples of the Tao Masters were looking for, the cultivator that might affect the position of the Tao Masters' disciples. It was also because of this that an existence like Taoist Zun Huo was clearly aware of everything that had happened in the forbidden area on this day, in the depths of the forbidden area, where the endless light was the brightest and also the darkest. Luo Fan sat with his legs crossed and stretched his body slightly. Countless mysterious auras flowed out from his body, causing the endless light around him to distort. It even caused the space in the 5th level to ripple strangely. I've finally completely stabilized my cultivation. After a while, he recovered, and a satisfied look appeared on his face. After spending 8 million years and using the convenience of the forbidden area, he had finally digested all the things he had gained after going through the 6th tribulation, allowing his cultivation to completely break away from the early stage of the 6th tribulation and truly stand at the middle stage of the 6th tribulation. Of course, this was not a fixed level. It was just how stable he felt his cultivation was. The biggest change was that he could faintly sense the existence of the 7th Great Tribulation. Although the feeling was vague and faint, and he could not be sure how much time and how many years it would take, the fact that he could sense its existence was enough to show that he had completely stabilized his position as a sixth tribulation powerhouse. What a wonderful cultivation environment! Perhaps this forbidden area is the true essence of the fifth level. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan looked at the endless light around him, or rather, the endless darkness, and murmured. The reason why he could make such progress in 8 million years was not only because of his own efforts, but also because of the environment of the forbidden area. This forbidden area was an extremely dangerous place for other cultivators, even for the disciples of Tao masters, because there was an extremely strong light that was similar to the light of heaven and earth here. This light actually existed in every corner of the entire fifth level. It existed in all the creatures, all the matter, and even all the energy in the fifth level. In fact, the countless rays of light that formed the entire fifth level were similar to the light of heaven and earth. This light had the appearance of the light of heaven and earth, and had many characteristics of the light of heaven and earth. If it was not for the fact that it did not have the will of heaven and earth that the light of heaven and earth should have, it would actually be the real light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because this was the nature of the light that countless cultivators could comprehend the nature of the light of heaven and earth by cultivating in this universe that was formed by countless rays of light. They could comprehend how to condense the light of heaven and earth. From this point of view, there should be endless benefits for cultivators to have such rich light in this forbidden area. However, it was obvious that things could not be considered from such a simple point of view. This kind of light was beneficial for cultivators to comprehend the light of heaven and earth, but it did not mean that the more this kind of light was, the more benefits it would bring. However, there was actually a limit to this. Under this limit, the more and more intense the light was, the more beneficial it would be to the cultivator's comprehension. However, once this limit was exceeded, the more and more intense the light was, the more dangerous it would be for the cultivator. And this limit was obviously close to the level of the endless matter, energy, and light contained in the boundless void in the entire fifth level. In other words, it was a level that was tens of thousands of times weaker than the light in the forbidden area. As a result, the amount of light in the forbidden area was clearly a disaster, not a good thing, for the cultivators in the forbidden area. If there were cultivators who could not resist the endless light here, as long as they stayed here for a certain amount of time, their bodies, power, and everything else would be corroded by the light, assimilated, and finally completely turned into a part of the light, disappearing without a trace. It was precisely because of this that this place was treated as a forbidden area. Of course, the mysteries of creation far exceeded the limits of living beings' imagination. Even though it was such a forbidden area, it wasn't completely empty. Because the light in this forbidden area was too intense, it produced all sorts of mysterious changes, forming all sorts of special places that could not be seen in the outside world. It could be space-time, world, heaven and earth, or even some kind of treasure. It was even possible that some strange creatures were born somewhere in this forbidden area. This kind of existence in the forbidden area was obviously very attractive to the cultivators in the outside world. It was said that in the past, a cultivator was extremely lucky and found a strange flower in this forbidden area. From it, he obtained all sorts of comprehension about the light of heaven and earth, and directly broke through the bottleneck. In just a few years, he had just condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to the level of the light of heaven and earth completion. Because of this, even though they knew that this forbidden area was dangerous, there was almost no time for cultivators to rest. With this background, Luo Fan occupied this forbidden area and called himself the master of this forbidden area. Any cultivator who wanted to step into this forbidden area had to get his permission before they could do so. This was why there was such a fierce reaction, and even the fifth senior brother was finally alarmed. Fortunately, Luo Fan's current light of heaven and earth was definitely considered to be complete by the standards of the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. His strength had long been close to invincible in the 5th level. Therefore, even though there was such a huge reaction, he still firmly guarded this forbidden area, and now he had become a veritable master. As for the cultivators who wanted to enter this forbidden area to cultivate or search for opportunities, Luo Fan did not actually want anything from them. As long as those cultivators were willing to apply to him and were willing to abide by his rules, he would allow them to enter. In this way, for the cultivators on the 5th level, the addition of a master here did not affect them too much. At most, they would be restrained in name. Perhaps it was because of this that they gradually settled down and acknowledged Luo Fan's rule over this forbidden area. They were also willing to apply to Luo Fan before they entered. Because they had scruples, the situation in this forbidden area was more stable than before Luo Fan's arrival, and there were fewer killings. Chapter 2441. At the center of the forbidden area, Luo Fan was floating in the air. His light of heaven and earth was still floating behind his head like a group of worlds. The astonishing light in the forbidden area seemed to have incorporated the light of heaven and earth into its circulation system. It entered the light of heaven and earth from all directions and left the light of heaven and earth from another direction. Or, from another point of view, the light of heaven and earth had incorporated the endless light around it into its circulation system, in the process of the endless light being absorbed by the light of heaven and earth. The countless spacetime, worlds, and heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth seemed to be absorbing some invisible nutrients, and its essence was constantly strengthening. The endless will of heaven and earth hidden in it seemed to be immersed in some kind of indescribable state of growth, as if it was constantly being replenished and climbing to a higher level. Through the imprint of the light of heaven and earth, the forbidden area was now almost completely under Luo Fan's control. He knew all the spacetime, worlds, heaven and earth treasures, and all kinds of strange natural landscapes in the forbidden area. As for the creatures that were adventuring in the forbidden area, he knew every single one of them. At this moment, there were a total of 37,000 cultivators in the forbidden area. Among them, there were only about 3,000 disciples of the Tao Master. The remaining 30,000 were all independent cultivators. Of course, this did not mean that the number of disciples of the Tao Master in the 5th level was much less than that of the independent cultivators. Instead, it was because the two had different attitudes towards the forbidden area. In fact, in the 5th level, the difference between the number of disciples of the Tao Master and the number of independent cultivators was not too big. Although the number of independent cultivators was slightly more than that of the Tao Master, the difference was only 1 or 2 times. The reason why the difference in the number of cultivators who entered the forbidden area to cultivate and search for opportunities was actually quite simple. It was because the disciples of the Tao Master did not trust Luo Fan. For them, the addition of a ruler like Luo Fan in this forbidden area was like having a sharp blade that could fall at any time. They had entered such a forbidden area, but they did not have the same sense of security that they had in the past. As a result, only a few of them were careless or had no choice but to come. Only then would they choose to cultivate in the forbidden area. In comparison, it was a different story for rogue cultivators. Although there were still many rogue cultivators who had doubts about Luo Fan's existence, there were more cultivators who felt that it would not affect them. After all, these rogue cultivators were originally looked down upon by the Tao Master's disciples. Almost everywhere, as long as they had enough value, they would be suppressed by the disciples of the Tao Master, and they would be inferior to the disciples of the Tao Master. In that case, what difference would it make to them if there was another ruler in the forbidden area? In fact, if one were to think about it from another perspective, the addition of this ruler would give them more confidence and safety in front of the Tao Master's disciples. From this point of view, it was actually a good thing. It was precisely because of this that the number of rogue cultivators in the forbidden area was not greatly affected. If this entire forbidden area was placed in an ordinary universe, it would actually be a black hole. An extremely strange black hole where even light could not escape its gravitational pull. In such a forbidden area, the various laws were actually very different from the fifth level in the outside world. It could even be said that it had formed a complete independent small world. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. In a flash, he had already arrived at an extremely special location in the forbidden area along with the light of heaven and earth. This location was not at the core of the forbidden land. Instead, it was quite a distance away from the core. At first glance, this place did not seem any different from other locations. In fact, since ancient times, not many cultivators had discovered the strangeness of this location. At the very least, with Luo Fan's current control over this forbidden area, he could sense that there had not been many auras left in this place since ancient times. Although his light of heaven and earth had moved, the connection between it and the surrounding light was still not severed. Even though it had shifted its position, it still continued to absorb the endless light around it, trying its best to absorb the mysterious principles and profundities contained in the light. How wonderful! Even the layer barriers have been distorted. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly as he looked at the strange location in front of him. At first glance, this strange location did not seem any different from other locations. It was just like a very ordinary area in the forbidden area. However, with Luo Fan's eyesight, he could tell at a glance that the layer barriers in this location had already been greatly distorted. This distortion caused the many layers in this location to interweave together. Reality, existence, cause and effect, illusion, and so on. Countless layers had already completely intertwined here. This intertwining made this location seem extremely chaotic, causing the many layers in this location to connect with each other in the process. In fact, with his eyesight, he could even see the scenes of the many other layers. He narrowed his eyes, and his eyesight became extremely powerful. At this moment, the connections between the many other layers were instantly triggered, following which, he saw countless reflections of himself in it. They were reflections of the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers. Under this reflection, he seemed to have become an indescribably mysterious existence. It was a mysterious existence that was eternal and indestructible. Even if the heavens and the earth were to perish and the chaos were to perish, it still wouldn't be able to shake him. This existence was so mysterious that it had an unimaginable attraction to him. He could not help but want to immerse himself in it and completely turn himself into the existence that was reflected in this reflection. This attraction was so powerful that it almost instantly broke through his rational defenses. He could not help but start moving his feet involuntarily. At this moment, the light in the world behind his head suddenly began to tremble. Following this tremble, a vast and boundless will directly swept through his mind. As it swept through his will, he instantly felt a chill in his heart. His originally hazy mind suddenly sobered up, and his eyes became clear again. After regaining his clarity, he suddenly felt a lingering fear. His gaze towards the strange location had already become extremely vigilant. Under this vigilance, when he looked at his reflection again, he no longer felt the irresistible impulse from before. He could finally see the existence that was like a reflection clearly. I was almost done for. I really can't be careless at all. This thought flashed through his mind. The reflection of the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers was indeed extremely mysterious. The eternal and indestructible aura that it gave off was not an illusion. If he really gathered all the existences of the various planes into one and completely fused with it, there was indeed a chance that he could obtain this kind of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility. However, the price that he would have to pay was far too great. It was so great that even thinking about it made his heart tremble. This was because the price was none other than his will and his freedom. There was naturally no need to say more about the price of his will. With Luo Fan's current level, with his current cultivation, although he could establish close connections with the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers, and could also transmit his will to the countless layers. However, in the end, it was only one layer of reality. Under such circumstances, if he were to fuse with the existences that corresponded to him in countless other planes, then his consciousness on the plane of reality would be equivalent to being covered by countless layers of gauze. His thoughts, all of them would be completely submerged by the various instincts brought about by the existences that corresponded to him in different planes. A single layer of gauze would already have some effect on one's vision. If countless layers of gauze were to be stacked together, the effect would be obvious. It would definitely directly cover his vision. In other words, it would completely imprison his will. At that time, even if he obtained eternal and indestructible aura, what could he do? How could he still be him? At most, he would be a walking corpse. Just this point alone was enough to make Luo Fan not dare to make this choice. Moreover, there was also another point. After fusing, his freedom would be greatly restricted. After all, the reason why the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers could meet was because of this rather special location. Under such circumstances, once he fused here, if he wanted to leave this place, he would be obstructed by all the layers. The pulling force of the countless layers on the existences that belonged to him would firmly fix him in this place, unable to escape, unable to leave. Even if he disregarded everything and wanted to challenge the pulling force of the countless layers, in the end, the biggest possibility was that he would tear himself apart again, and once again separate the existences that corresponded to him in the various layers. This was still a possibility that he could think about rationally. If another weakness was added, that his will would be submerged and imprisoned, leaving only his instincts to control the body formed by the existences that corresponded to him in the various layers, then the possibility of splitting again would be completely eliminated. After all, if only his instincts were left, how could his body seek to split itself again? Without such a firm will, naturally, he would not be able to use the pulling force to tear his body apart again, and turn into the countless existences in the countless layers. Fortunately, Luo Fan secretly rejoiced at this moment. He turned back to look at the light of heaven and earth, and found that it had not changed at all compared to before, as if nothing had happened. As for the changes that occurred in the light of heaven and earth just now, Luo Fan was quite clear about what was going on. That was the will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth. After realizing that he had lost his rationality and done something that was extremely dangerous to himself, woke him up. The will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth was indeed unable to communicate with Luo Fan, but that did not mean that the will of heaven and earth was useless, and it did not mean that the will of heaven and earth could not weigh and think. In fact, the reason why he could not communicate with the will of heaven and earth was only because his level of thinking was completely different from that of the will of heaven and earth. Whether it was knowledge or rationality, the will of heaven and earth was far superior to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the will of heaven and earth still prevented Luo Fan from stepping into that strange place, which was enough to show how dangerous this action was. After all, the will of heaven and earth did not care about Luo Fan's various suicidal actions in the Great Tribulation, and it did not even touch him at all. After watching for a while, Luo Fan shifted his gaze from the light of heaven and earth to another direction. In that direction, in a place that was millions of kilometers away, there was a being that was asking him for instructions. It was an itinerant cultivator. An itinerant cultivator who had already formed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, but had not truly formed it. This itinerant cultivator was currently on a strange continent. From the outside, this continent only looked like a piece of soil with a circumference of several thousand feet. However, as long as one stepped onto the surface of this piece of soil, one would discover that its volume had increased by billions of times. It was a vast and boundless continent, a continent that gave birth to countless living beings, a large number of civilizations, and even nurtured a large number of cultivators. At this moment, this itinerant cultivator was on a peak of this continent, asking Luo Fan for instructions. Or rather, pleading. The itinerant cultivator knelt on the ground and said anxiously, "Ruler, please lower the curtains and save my Tao partner. I am willing to give you all my assets." His embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth seemed to be boiling at this moment, constantly rising and retracting on the surface of his body. As it rose and retracted, a strange wave was transmitted along with his words, converging into the endless darkness around the continent. In other words, it was the endless light that could only be reversed when things reached an extreme. Finally, it was transmitted to where Luo Fan was, and Luo Fan heard it. "Begging me to save her? Don't tell me you're treating me like a babysitter?" Luo Fan frowned, and he was shocked. He had indeed saved people before. However, in this forbidden area, he had never made a move. If that was the case, why did this person think that he would save his Tao partner? Chapter 2442. This forbidden area was now under Luo Fan's complete control. This kind of control was not enough for him to completely comprehend all the mysteries of this forbidden area. However, when it came to deducing what a cultivator had experienced here, it was only a matter of a thought. At this moment, Chern Heng's heart skipped a beat. The various experiences of this cultivator after entering the forbidden area flashed before his eyes like a movie. Through these scenes, Chern Heng understood what the cultivator's Tao companion had experienced and where she was now. "I didn't expect to have such a fortuitous encounter. It's a pity that he didn't have enough insight and couldn't see through it." After understanding all of this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. In actuality, the cultivator's Tao companion did not encounter any misfortune or fall into a hopeless situation as the cultivator had imagined. Instead, she had obtained some kind of astonishing fortuitous encounter. At this moment, not far away from the mountain the cultivator was on, there was a deep and unfathomable abyss that was emitting boundless cold air. This cold air was extremely strange. It was like a living creature, lingering at the entrance of the abyss without dispersing at all. Due to this structure, the cold air within the abyss had already completely frozen space. However, the air outside the abyss did not feel the slightest bit cold. At this moment, the cultivator's Tao companion was inside the abyss. She was like a statue, quietly floating tens of thousands of kilometers above the ground. This abyss was surrounded by blooming flowers. It looked extremely beautiful, making this valley look like a paradise on earth. Back then, it was because of the beauty of this place that the cultivator's Tao companion was interested in. As a result, she accidentally hid in the abyss and was frozen by the cold air, making her look like a dead statue. From then until now, more than 300,000 years had passed. During these 300,000 years, that cultivator had tried everything he could think of. There were even a few times when his embryonic light of heaven and earth had almost collapsed, let alone the fellow Taoists he was acquainted with. Even if he had only met them once, he had shamelessly begged them for their help. But in the end, he was utterly unable to rescue his Tao companion from the abyss. In fact, let alone fishing it out, even if he sent any of his power into the abyss, it would be frozen by the abyss. If he reacted a little slower, it wouldn't just be his power that would be frozen. Even his body, his spirit, and his essence would be frozen. It was precisely because the 300,000 years had not yielded any results that the cultivator had no choice but to place his last hope on the ruler of this forbidden land. "I've been guarding my Taoist companion who thinks she's a corpse for over 300,000 years. Luo Fan sighed with emotion. 300,000 years was not a long time for cultivators, but it also depended on the time. In terms of the cultivator's current state, 300,000 years was not much different from 3,030 billion years. After all, every minute and second spent in this position was an indescribable torment for him. However, even in this torment, the cultivator did not waver at all. In the end, he even made Luo Fan the target of his pleas. Luo Fan could not help but admire his deep feelings for his Taoist companion. "Forget it. Since that's the case, I'll give you a chance." With a thought, Luo Fan released a projection that directly condensed on the mountain peak on the continent. At this moment, the cultivator was kneeling on the ground and begging. His voice was close to tears, and his body was filled with an increasingly intense sense of despair. Under these circumstances, Luo Fan's projection directly appeared in front of him, but it took a long time for him to catch his attention. When he raised his head and saw Luo Fan, he could not help but reveal a hint of joy amidst the despair. He kowtowed vigorously and cried out, "Thank you, ruler! Thank you, ruler!" Obviously, he had already confirmed Luo Fan's appearance through various means, so he could confirm Luo Fan's identity when he first appeared. The cultivator's face was already covered in tears as he spoke, and his forehead had even begun to bleed. Obviously, an expert who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth was able to kowtow until his head bled, which was enough to show how promising he was. As he spoke, he directly opened up the countless worlds that he had opened up and said, "These are all my possessions, and I'm willing to offer them all. I only hope that ruler can save my Taoist companion." Each of the countless worlds had its own characteristic. They contained all kinds of mysterious structures, and there were countless mysterious creatures in them. There were also all kinds of mysterious things hidden in them that Luo Fan had never heard of before. It could be said that these worlds alone were already of considerable value. If these worlds were taken to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it would definitely be enough to cause all the cultivators there, whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or independent cultivators, to fight to the death for them. However, these were obviously meaningless to Luo Fan. To him, he could create everything that this cultivator before him could offer with a single thought. In fact, the things that he created would definitely be more mysterious and precious than anything that this cultivator could offer. He smiled faintly and said, "I'm not interested in your possessions. I already know about your Taoist companion. She isn't facing any danger right now, but she has encountered an opportunity for her cultivation. Based on her current state, she will return in about 3 million years. When that time comes, not only will she be able to completely form the light of heaven and earth, she might even bring some unexpected treasures." Hearing this, the cultivator could not help but be stunned. Instinctively, a look of disbelief appeared on his face. After all, what Luo Fan said was just too unimaginable. His Taoist companion had clearly turned into a dead object in the abyss, so why was this person saying that it was not misfortune or a hopeless situation, but an opportunity? "It's not that I don't believe the ruler, it's just that the ruler's words are too unbelievable," the cultivator muttered. Luo Fan continued to smile and said, "You'll know if it's unbelievable or not after a while. It's only 3 million years, it's not that long." Hearing this, the cultivator nodded instinctively. Although he still had some doubts about what Luo Fan said, he was still given hope, allowing him to vent a lot of the pressure in his heart. As such, although the weight was still unbearable, it was much easier than before. If he waited with this mentality, 3 million years was indeed not that long. "Thank you for your guidance, ruler. If it's true, then this junior's life is in your hands," the cultivator said straightforwardly. "Why would I want your life?" Luo Fan smiled and shook his head. "I'm just helping you because you can protect your Taoist companion for half a year." As he spoke, his heart trembled slightly, and his figure slowly dispersed. When the cultivator saw that Luo Fan really didn't ask for anything, he was stunned for a moment. Then, he smiled bitterly and kowtowed in the direction Luo Fan had disappeared, kowtowing 9 times in a row. Although Luo Fan had only given him a few words and pointed out another possibility, this had completely changed the fate of both him and his wife. He wouldn't sink into despair, and his wife would have a chance to meet again. To them, this was an enormous favor. The cultivator was naturally indescribably grateful, and didn't dare forget about it. He'd already made up his mind. In the future, he would definitely repay the ruler's kindness. After doing this, Luo Fan didn't withdraw his attention. Instead, he threw himself into the depths of the abyss in the valley not far away and dived towards the deepest part of the abyss. The cold air in the abyss was actually an extremely wondrous existence. It was actually a product of the light of heaven and earth that had mutated. This light of heaven and earth was extremely wondrous. It was vastly different from all the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had seen before. Most light of heaven and earth was pure light. Although it had all sorts of mysteries, it was still just a carrier of the will of the world. However, the light of heaven and earth in the abyss was completely different. This light of heaven and earth had already lost its balance. The concept of cold that belonged to the light of heaven and earth had already expanded tens of thousands of times. Because of the expansion of this concept of cold, the nature of the light of heaven and earth changed. In the end, it turned into this cold air that lingered in the abyss and couldn't be dispersed. Under these circumstances, anything that fell into the abyss would actually be suppressed by the light of heaven and earth. If there wasn't anything special, it would definitely be erased immediately. Whether it was power, concepts, ideas, or anything else, it was the same. From this perspective, the fact that the cultivator's cultivation companion could still maintain her figure after falling into the abyss for 300,000 years was enough to show how extraordinary she was. With Luo Fan's ability, after discovering the extraordinariness of this cultivator, he was naturally able to deduce the extraordinariness of this cultivator immediately. In fact, the reason why this woman could still survive in the abyss was because the path she cultivated was similar to this cold Tao. Of course, it was not the cold Tao that ordinary living beings understood. Instead, it was the cold Tao that was more profound, more advanced, and tens of thousands of times more profound. This cold Tao was enough to freeze the universe, freeze concepts, and freeze concepts. Because of the cold Tao that she cultivated, she had an unimaginable affinity with the light of heaven and earth that had lost balance. As a result, after she fell into the abyss, although she was constantly being eroded by the light of heaven and earth, she was also resonating with the light of heaven and earth, allowing her light of heaven and earth fledgling form to constantly absorb nutrients from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. The erosion of the light of heaven and earth that had lost balance caused the woman to fall into a state where she was close to death. It made her seem like a statue or a corpse. The light of heaven and earth fledgling form absorbed nutrients from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. Not only did it keep her alive, but it also allowed her to constantly immerse herself in the various experiences brought about by the light of heaven and earth. Not only did it allow her light of heaven and earth fledgling form to grow continuously, but it also allowed her to grow continuously. I didn't expect the light of heaven and earth to change like this. Looks like my understanding of the light of heaven and earth is still lacking. Luo Fan looked at the scene in the abyss and could not help but sigh. His understanding of the light of heaven and earth was derived from his own understanding of the world and his understanding of cultivation. The results of these deductions were enough for him to use the light of heaven and earth to become much more powerful than almost all the other cultivators on the 5th level. He did not need to belittle himself in this regard. However, he had to admit that the results of his deductions were still lacking in certain aspects. At the very least, his deductions were far from enough in terms of the various small applications. At this moment, the fact that the light of heaven and earth could possess such astonishing properties through the loss of balance was a great revelation to him. It instantly opened up a new world, allowing him to be filled with countless inspirations. While he was comprehending, the cluster of worlds formed by the light of heaven and earth behind his main body's head suddenly underwent all sorts of indescribable changes. The originally pure light suddenly turned into ice, then into flames, then into green wood, then into soil, then into strange metals, then into nothingness, then into clouds, then into countless runes. Looking over, it was as if the light of heaven and earth had suddenly become all things in the world. Furthermore, the changes were not just on the surface. Instead, it was a fundamental change that went deep into the light of heaven and earth, and even reached deep into the world's will. When the light of heaven and earth turned into ice and cold chi, the entire light of heaven and earth looked like a piece of ice and a ball of cold chi. When it turned into flames, it would become a real ball of fire. This went on and on. No matter what the light of heaven and earth turned into, it would be a complete and fundamental change. After the change, there would be no trace of the original light of heaven and earth at all. In just a few breaths' time, countless changes appeared on the light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan's head. Eventually, all the changes disappeared, and the light of heaven and earth turned into a cluster of worlds again, hovering behind his head. However, compared to before, the cluster of worlds seemed to have undergone some subtle changes as well. It seemed like each world had become more realistic and complete. At the same time, Luo Fan felt a strange sense of smoothness in his heart. It was as if the artificial limbs that were attached to his body had become his real limbs.